There exists a hidden structure of categories within the world of Pokémon, a gentle system of categories that organizes hundreds of creatures into patterns and groups that reveal themselves slowly when you pay attention. Some categories define how Pokémon breed, others describe evolutionary paths that branch in unexpected directions, and still others classify beings that arrived from distant dimensions or forgotten eras. Each classification tells a small story about design choices made years ago, mechanics built to surprise players, and thoughtful systems that deepened the way trainers understood their companions. Tonight, we drift through these categories one by one, letting each reveal its purpose in the larger ecosystem. Before we drift off, consider subscribing so you never miss an upload, and comment where you're watching from. The best place to start is where the smallest members of the Pokémon world first appeared, where baby Pokémon entered the games as gentle additions to evolutionary lines that already existed. Baby Pokémon arrived quietly in Generation 2, introduced as pre-evolutions for creatures that trainers already knew and loved from the original games. These smaller, younger forms could not breed themselves, setting them apart from first-stage Pokémon like Charmander or Bulbasaur, who could produce eggs despite being unevolved. The distinction felt subtle at first, a small mechanical choice, but it carried implications for how players thought about growth and development in this world. A Pichu could not participate in breeding until it evolved into Pikachu, creating a natural sense of maturity tied to evolution rather than just level or strength. This breeding restriction placed baby Pokémon in the undiscovered egg group, a classification reserved for creatures too young or too rare to reproduce. The choice reinforced the idea that these Pokémon represented childhood, a stage where certain biological functions simply had not developed yet. It added a layer of realism to a world already defined by fantastical elements, grounding the mechanics in something recognizable even as the creatures themselves remained impossible. Trainers accepted this limitation without question because it felt appropriate, natural, in the context of how living beings grow and change. Some baby Pokémon required specific incense items to breed, adding another layer of complexity to their acquisition. If a Blissey held a luck incense while breeding, the egg would contain a Happiny rather than a Chansey, creating a deliberate choice for trainers who wanted the baby form. Without the incense, the egg defaulted to the first stage evolution, bypassing the baby entirely. This system persisted from Generation 3 through Generation 8, providing a rationale for why these baby Pokémon had not appeared in earlier games where their evolved forms already existed. And before you settle in, maybe tap subscribe for more calm stories, and share as where in the world you're watching from tonight. The incense mechanic felt like a gentle puzzle, a small task that rewarded players who paid attention to breeding details. It gave purpose to items that might otherwise sit unused in bags, transforming them into keys that unlocked specific Pokémon. Trainers learned which incense corresponded to which baby, memorizing combinations like sea incense for Azurill or rose incense for Budu, and the system became part of the knowledge base that separated casual players from dedicated breeders. It was one of many small complexities that deepened engagement without overwhelming those who simply wanted to explore. Generation 9 changed this mechanic, removing the incense requirement entirely and allowing baby Pokémon to appear from eggs regardless of held items. The shift simplified breeding, making baby forms more accessible to players who might not have discovered or understood the incense system. It reflected a broader design philosophy in recent games, one that reduced barriers to completion and streamlined mechanics that had grown unwieldy over multiple generations. Some longtime players mourned the loss of this small piece of complexity, while others appreciated the convenience of predictable egg outcomes. Alongside the incense change, Generation 9 also removed exclusive egg moves from baby Pokémon, moves that could only be learned by specific baby forms and not their evolutions. These unique moves had provided small advantages to trainers willing to keep Pokémon in their baby stages, creating niche competitive strategies around creatures like Pichu or Togepi. Their removal standardized movesets across evolutionary lines, eliminating situations where a baby Pokémon might have access to something its evolved form could not learn. The change made sense from a balance perspective, even as it erased another layer of strategic depth. Most baby Pokémon function as cross-gen pre-evolutions, added in later generations to give existing Pokémon new depth and breeding possibilities. Azurill, Wynot, and Mime Jr. all arrived as pre-evolutions for Pokémon that had existed without baby forms in previous games, retroactively expanding their evolutionary lines. These additions felt natural, filling gaps that players had not necessarily noticed, but accepted once they appeared. A few baby Pokémon, however, debuted alongside their evolved forms in the same generation, like Riolu with Lucario or Togepi with Togetic, introducing complete evolutionary lines rather than extending existing ones. The presence of baby Pokémon changed how trainers thought about evolution as a concept, framing it as a longer journey with more stages rather than a simple transformation from weak to strong. It introduced ideas about childhood and growth that resonated emotionally even in a game about capturing creatures and battling. Parents who played Pokémon with their children found these baby forms particularly appealing, recognizing in them a reflection of early development and the passage from dependence to capability. The mechanics supported the theme, and the theme enriched the mechanics, creating a feedback loop that strengthened both. Slowly, the story widens as we move beyond baby Pokémon into split evolutions, a category defined by choice and branching paths that diverge from single points. Split evolutions introduce the concept that not all Pokémon needed to follow linear progression, that some species could evolve into different forms depending on conditions, items, or trainer decisions. This mechanic first appeared subtly in Generation 1 with Eevee's 3 possible evolutions, then expanded across subsequent generations to include dozens of Pokémon with 2, 3, or even 8 different evolutionary outcomes. Eevee remains the most iconic example of split evolutions, its 8 different forms representing distinct types and playstyles that cater to various teams, compositions, and strategic preferences. A trainer holding a Water Stone could create Vaporeon, while a Thunderstone produced Jolteon, and a Firestone resulted in Flareon. Later generations added evolutions tied to happiness and location, like Espeon and Umbreon, or specific stones like Leafeon and Glaceon, or even affection mechanics for Sylveon. Each evolution offered different stats, different movesets, and different roles in battle, turning a single Eevee into 8 potential teammates. The branching nature of split evolutions created meaningful choices for players, moments where they had to decide which direction suited their needs or preferences. Unlike linear evolutions, where the path was predetermined, split evolutions required considerations of type coverage, stat distribution, and aesthetic appeal. Some trainers chose based on competitive viability, selecting the evolution with the best stats or most useful ability. Others chose based on design, preferring the appearance of one form over another regardless of battle potential. Both approaches were valid, and the game supported both without judgment. Different split evolutions often featured different types, expanding the strategic implications of the choice. Gloom could become Vileplume, retaining its grass poison typing, or Bellossom, losing the poison type for pure grass. The type change affected weaknesses, resistances, and move compatibility, making the decision more complex than simply choosing between two versions of the same Pokémon. Trainers had to consider how each evolution would fit into their team, what coverage it provided, and how it interacted with other Pokémon they planned to use. Stat distributions varied between split evolutions as well, even when the total base stat count remained identical. The evolutions all share the same base stat total of 525, but those points are allocated differently across HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. Vaporeon becomes a bulky special attacker with high HP and special attack, while Flareon focuses on physical attack with moderate defensive stats, and Jolteon prioritizes speed and special attack. These distributions create distinct roles, ensuring that each evolution feels mechanically different despite sharing the same numerical foundation. Some split evolutions showcase more subtle differences, with Vileplume and Bellossom offering an example of slight stat variations rather than dramatic shifts. Both are viable in similar roles, but Vileplume has slightly higher special attack, while Bellossom has better defense, creating small advantages in specific situations without making one objectively superior to the other. This design philosophy respects player preference, allowing aesthetic or thematic choices to coexist with competitive considerations. A trainer who prefers Bellossom's design is not punished with a significantly weaker Pokémon, just one with marginally different strengths. The introduction of split evolutions added diversity to competitive battling, expanding the number of viable Pokémon and strategic options available to players. Instead of every trainer using the same Slowpoke evolution, some could choose Slowbro for its defense, while others selected Slowking for its special defense and slightly different stat spread. Both served similar roles as bulky water psychic types, but their differences allowed for personal expression within competitive play. This diversity kept the metagame fresh and prevented every team from looking identical. Split evolutions also encouraged experimentation and replayability, giving players reasons to start new games or breed multiple members of the same species to experience different evolutionary outcomes. A trainer might use Politoed in one playthrough and Poliwrath in another, experiencing how each evolution changed battle strategies and team dynamics. This flexibility extended the life of the games, providing fresh experiences without requiring entirely new Pokémon or regions. The same creatures could feel different depending on which evolutionary path was chosen. As we drift a little deeper tonight, cross-gen evolutions appear as another category, one that bridges generations and gives new life to Pokémon that had existed for years without further development. Cross-gen evolutions are evolutions introduced in later generations for Pokémon from earlier games, extending evolutionary lines that had previously been complete. These additions often aimed to strengthen weak Pokémon, provide love to unpopular species, or explore design concepts that had not been possible when the original Pokémon debuted. Primeape offers a clear example of how cross-gen evolutions can transform a Pokémon's viability. For generations, Primeape existed as a moderately powerful fighting type with decent stats, but no distinguishing features that made it stand out in competitive play. Generation 9 introduced Annihilape, a ghost-fighting evolution that became one of the most broken Pokémon in competitive Smogon tiers, forcing bans and reshaping team compositions. The evolution gave Primeape new purpose, elevating it from forgettable to essential and demonstrating how cross-gen evolutions can dramatically shift a Pokémon's place in the metagame. Dunsparce received similar attention with its evolution, Dudensparce, though the reception was mixed. The design resembled Dunsparce closely, simply extending its body rather than transforming it dramatically, leading some players to view it as more of a meme than a meaningful upgrade. Others appreciated the faithfulness to Dunsparce's original concept, arguing that not every evolution needed to be a radical departure. The debate highlighted how cross-gen evolutions walk a fine line between respecting original designs and providing substantial new content. Cross-gen regional forms also count as cross-gen evolutions, with Alolan Raichu serving as an example of this subcategory. Regional forms introduce type changes and stat adjustments tied to specific regions, creating alternate versions of familiar Pokémon that evolve differently depending on where they are raised. Alolan Raichu gains the Psychic type and the Surge Surfer ability, differentiating it from standard Raichu and providing new competitive options. These regional evolutions blur the line between form changes and true evolutions, existing in both categories simultaneously. The primary purpose of cross-gen evolutions is to give weak or unpopular Pokémon a second chance, an opportunity to become relevant again after years of obscurity. Pokémon like Yanma, Tangela, and Lickitung had languished in low tiers for generations before receiving evolutions in Generation 4 that dramatically improved their stats and movesets. Yanmega, Tangrowth, and Lickilicky all became viable in competitive play, proving that thoughtful design could redeem creatures that had been dismissed as unviable for years. Some cross-gen evolutions focus less on competitive balance and more on fan service, giving beloved but weak Pokémon the respect they deserve. Marilla's evolution into Azumarill in Generation 2, followed by the addition of baby Azurill in Generation 3, created a complete 3-stage line for a Pokémon that had been introduced as a Pikachu clone. Azumarill's huge power ability, introduced in later generations, transformed it into a powerful physical attacker despite its cute appearance, subverting expectations and creating one of the game's most enduring competitive threats. Cross-gen evolutions demonstrate the developer's willingness to revisit old designs and improve them rather than abandoning them in favor of entirely new creatures. This approach respects the history of the franchise, acknowledging that players form attachments to Pokémon regardless of their competitive viability. By giving these creatures new evolutions, the games validate those attachments and provide incentives to use old favorites in new contexts. It creates continuity across generations, linking the present to the past through evolutionary chains that span decades of game releases. Before we continue deeper into these facts, fossil Pokémon emerge as another distinct category, creatures that originated from preserved remains and were revived through scientific processes. Fossil Pokémon represent extinct species that once lived in the Pokémon world's ancient past. Their remains are preserved in rock formations until discovered by trainers and revived through laboratory processes. Each fossil corresponds to a specific Pokémon, with the items like Old Amber producing Aerodactyl and the Jaw fossil creating Tyrantrum. The revival process involves taking fossils to specialized facilities, or NPCs, who can reconstruct living Pokémon from the preserved genetic material. This mechanic introduces paleontology concepts into the games, teaching players about fossils and extinction in simplified form. The process mirrors real-world scientific efforts to study ancient life through fossil records, translating complex biological concepts into accessible gameplay mechanics. Trainers learn that fossils are rare, valuable, and tied to specific Pokémon that cannot be obtained through normal encounters. Generation 8 introduced a controversial twist to fossil Pokémon with its fossil fusion mechanic, allowing players to combine two different fossils to create single Pokémon with mismatched body parts. Dracozolt, Arctozolt, Draxovish, and Arctovish all resulted from these combinations, featuring upper and lower halves from different creatures awkwardly fused together. The designs sparked debate among fans, with some appreciating the dark humor of scientifically questionable revival methods, and others finding the results disturbing or poorly designed. The fusion mechanic raised questions about the ethics of fossil revival in the Pokémon world, suggesting that the scientists performing these reconstructions might not fully understand what they were recreating. The Pokédex entries for these fusion fossils often describe them as suffering from their mismatched parts, unable to breathe properly or move efficiently. This darker interpretation of fossil revival added unexpected depth to what had previously been a straightforward mechanic, forcing players to consider whether bringing extinct Pokémon back was always a good idea. Fossil Pokémon typically have base stat totals ranging from 495 to 521, placing them in the mid-tier range of power. They are stronger than most early-game Pokémon, but weaker than pseudo-legendaries or evolved starters, creating balanced options for players who invest time in finding and reviving fossils. Their stats are distributed to reflect their ancient origins, often emphasizing attack or defense rather than speed, reflecting the idea that prehistoric creatures were powerful but slow compared to modern Pokémon. Many fossil Pokémon share the rock type, a design choice that references their preservation in stone and their prehistoric nature. This typing creates unfortunate weaknesses to common types like water, grass, fighting, and ground, making fossil Pokémon challenging to use competitively despite their solid base stats. The rock typing also limits their move pool options, restricting coverage and defensive utility. Some fossil Pokémon combine rock with other types to mitigate these weaknesses, like Aerodactyl's rock flying combination or Tyrantrum's rock dragon pairing. The rarity of fossils in the games creates a sense of achievement when trainers finally obtain and revive them. Unlike most Pokémon that can be encountered repeatedly through random battles, fossils require exploration, puzzle solving, or specific event triggers to acquire. This scarcity makes fossil Pokémon feel special rewards for services, thorough exploration, rather than common encounters. Players remember where they found their fossils and the effort required to revive them, creating stronger emotional connections to these resurrected creatures. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where game mechanics intersect with real-world concepts to create educational entertainment. Fossil Pokémon teach children about paleontology, extinction, and scientific reconstruction through engaging gameplay rather than textbooks. The lessons are subtle, embedded in mechanics rather than explicit, but they register nonetheless. A child who revives an Aerodactyl from old amber might later recognize the connection to real amber fossils and dinosaur DNA, creating pathways to scientific curiosity that began with a video game. Variant Pokémon represent another category, distinct from regional forms, but related in concept. Variant Pokémon are creatures with different appearances or abilities based on conditions like gender, form changes, or environmental factors. These variations create diversity within species, allowing the same Pokémon to appear differently depending on specific circumstances. The category is broad, encompassing everything from subtle color differences to dramatic form changes that alter types and stats. Gender differences provide the most common form of variation, with Pokémon like Hippopotas showing different colorations for males and females. Male Hippopotas are tan, while females are dark brown, creating visual distinction without affecting stats or battle performance. These differences add realism to the Pokémon world, reflecting how sexual dimorphism exists in real animals. They also provide mild collecting incentives for players who want to obtain both versions of the same species. Some gender differences affect more than just appearance, influencing movesets or evolution possibilities. Combi can only evolve into Vespiquen if female, while male Combi remain unevolved regardless of level. This creates a functional difference tied to gender, making female Combi significantly more valuable to trainers seeking to complete their Pokédex. Similarly, Burmese evolutions differ based on gender, with males evolving into Mothim and females into Wormadam, creating two completely different Pokémon from the same base form. Form changes represent more dramatic variations, with Pokémon like Castform altering their type and appearance based on weather conditions. In sunny weather, Castform becomes Fire type, in rain it becomes Water type, and in hail it becomes Ice type, with its physical form shifting to reflect these changes. This mechanic ties battle conditions to Pokémon abilities, creating dynamic gameplay where the environment directly influences team composition and strategies. It adds unpredictability to battles, forcing trainers to account for form changes when planning their approaches. Rotom exemplifies form changes tied to items and appliances, transforming into different types depending on which household object it possesses. Rotom can become Rotom Heat, Rotom Wash, Rotom Frost, Rotom Fan, or Rotom Mow, each form changing its secondary type and granting access to a unique move. These forms create versatility, allowing a single Rotom to fill multiple roles depending on team needs. The appliance theme adds humor and personality to what could have been a straightforward type change mechanic. Mega Evolution introduced temporary form changes tied to held items and battle mechanics, allowing certain Pokémon to transform mid-battle into more powerful versions with altered stats, types, and abilities. Mega Evolutions were temporary, lasting only for the duration of a battle and requiring specific Megastones to activate. This mechanic created dramatic power spikes and strategic depth, as trainers had to choose when to Mega Evolve and which Pokémon on their team would hold a Megastone. The Mega Evolution mechanic was controversial, praised for its strategic depth and visual spectacle, but criticized for being unbalanced and limited to specific Pokémon. Only certain species could Mega Evolve, creating disparity between Pokémon with access to this mechanic and those without. Some Mega Evolutions were competitively dominant, warping the metagame around their presence, while others were too weak to justify using. The mechanic was eventually phased out in favor of Dynamax and Gigantamax in Generation 8, though it remains beloved by many players who miss its unique gameplay and dramatic transformations. Regional forms introduce another type of variation, creating alternate versions of existing Pokémon tied to specific regions. Alolan forms debuted in Generation 7, giving Pokémon like Vulpix, Exeggutor, and Meowth new types and appearances based on adaptation to the Alola region's climate and ecosystem. These regional variants sometimes have completely different types, like Alolan Vulpix becoming Ice type instead of Fire type, creating new competitive options and refreshing familiar designs. Galarian forms followed in Generation 8, introducing variations for the Galar region with similar type and design changes. Galarian Weezing gained the Fairy type, Galarian Ponyta became Psychic type, and Galarian Darumaka shifted from fire to ice. These regional forms demonstrated that environmental adaptation could produce dramatically different evolutionary outcomes, expanding the lore of how Pokémon evolve and change across different geographic locations. The mechanic also allowed developers to revisit old designs and reimagine them without invalidating the originals. Hisuian forms appeared in Pokemon Legends, Arceus, representing historical variants that existed in the past before modern regional forms developed. These forms often featured more primal or ancient aesthetics, reflecting their status as ancestors to current Pokemon. Hisuian forms added temporal dimension to regional variation, suggesting that Pokemon had changed not just across space, but across time as well. This deepened the lore surrounding evolution and adaptation, creating a richer history for the Pokemon world. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Paldean forms introduced the most recent regional variants in Generation 9, continuing the tradition of region-specific adaptations. These forms often tied into the region's Spanish-inspired culture and Mediterranean climate, creating variations that felt appropriate to their new environment. The continued addition of regional forms across multiple generations demonstrates the developer's commitment to this mechanic as a way to refresh old Pokemon and expand the variety available to players. Shiny Pokemon represent perhaps the most sought-after variation category, rare alternate colorations that appear with extremely low probability during wild encounters. Shiny Pokemon are functionally identical to their normal counterparts, possessing the same stats, moves, and abilities, but they feature different color schemes that make them immediately visually distinctive. The encounter rate for shiny Pokemon is typically 1 in 4,096 in most recent generations, though various methods can improve these odds. The appeal of shiny Pokemon lies entirely in their rarity and aesthetic value rather than any competitive advantage. Trainers spend hundreds of hours hunting for shinies, resetting encounters, or breeding eggs until the rare coloration appears. This pursuit creates dedicated communities of shiny hunters who share methods, celebrate successful encounters, and commiserate over long hunts. The emotional payoff when a shiny finally appears after hours of searching creates memorable gaming moments that players recall years later. Different generations have featured different shiny encounter rates and hunting methods, with Generation 2 introducing the concept and subsequent generations refining it. Shiny Pokemon in Generation 2 were tied to specific stat combinations, making them slightly more common in certain circumstances. Later generations randomized shiny encounters completely, making them purely chance-based. Methods like chaining, soft resetting, and Masuda method breeding emerged as strategies to improve shiny odds, giving dedicated hunters tools to reduce the time required. The introduction of shiny locks in certain games prevented specific Pokemon from appearing as shinies, typically legendary or event Pokemon that the developers wanted to remain standardized. These locks frustrated shiny hunters who wanted to obtain shiny versions of every Pokemon, creating artificial scarcity even beyond the already low shiny rates. Some locks were later removed in subsequent games or events, allowing previously unobtainable shinies to become available through specific methods or distributions. Shiny hunting evolved into a major aspect of Pokemon culture, with streamers broadcasting their hunts live and YouTube channels dedicated to documenting successful shiny encounters. The community developed terminology and strategies, sharing knowledge about the most efficient hunting methods and celebrating rare finds. This subculture demonstrated how a simple cosmetic variation could generate deep engagement and community building, transforming a minor feature into a major aspect of the game's longevity. Shadow Pokemon appeared in the Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness spin-off games, representing Pokemon with closed hearts that had been artificially corrupted by evil organizations. These shadow Pokemon could not level up or gain experience until purified, creating a rescue and rehabilitation mechanic unique to those games. Shadow Pokemon had access to powerful shadow moves that were super effective against all types but damaged the user's heart, gradually closing it further with each use. The purification process required care and attention, with trainers battling alongside Shadow Pokemon and using special purification chambers to restore their hearts. Once purified, these Pokemon became normal again, capable of leveling and evolving. The mechanic added emotional depth to the spin-off games, framing Pokemon as victims of abuse who needed rescue rather than simple tools for battle. It created narratives about redemption and healing that resonated with players who appreciated the darker themes. Totem Pokemon existed in Generation 7 as powerful boss encounters that called for allies during battle and possessed stat boosts that made them challenging opponents. These Pokemon guarded trial sites in the Alola region, serving as tests for trainers seeking to complete the island challenge. Totem Pokemon were larger than normal versions of their species, appearing with dramatic animations that emphasized their significance. Defeating them granted rewards and progression through the story. The totem mechanic created memorable set-piece battles that broke from the standard wild encounter formula. These fights required strategy and preparation, as the totem Pokemon's allies and stat boosts made them formidable opponents even with level advantages. The battles felt like boss fights in other RPGs, providing climactic moments in the Island Challenge questline. Some totem Pokemon could be obtained after completing certain post-game requirements, allowing trainers to add these special variants to their collections. Alpha Pokemon appeared in Pokemon Legends, Arceus as large, aggressive variants with perfect stats and enhanced aggression. These Pokemon actively pursued the player character, creating dangerous encounters in the open world. Alpha Pokemon were visually distinct due to their size and glowing red eyes, making them easy to identify from a distance. Catching or defeating Alpha Pokemon provided valuable resources and powerful team members with guaranteed perfect stats in certain areas. The Alpha mechanic encouraged careful exploration and strategic thinking, as encountering an Alpha Pokemon unprepared could result in quick defeat. Trainers learned to avoid or prepare for these encounters, creating risk-reward scenarios where attempting to catch an Alpha early could provide a powerful team member but required skill and resource management. The mechanic added tension to exploration, transforming the world into a place where danger could appear from unexpected directions. Noble Pokemon served as boss battles in Pokemon Legends. Arceus, featuring Pokemon that had been driven into frenzied states and required special battle mechanics to calm. These fights combined traditional Pokemon battles with action elements, requiring players to dodge attacks while throwing bombs to calm the frenzied Noble. The battles felt unique within the Pokemon series, blending genres and creating memorable encounters that differentiated Legends, Arceus, from mainline games. Each noble Pokemon represented a different species and required different strategies to calm, creating varied challenges throughout the game. The frenzied state was tied to the game's plot, explaining why these normally peaceful Pokemon had become aggressive. Calming the nobles advanced the story and unlocked new areas, making these battles essential to progression. The mechanic demonstrated the developer's willingness to experiment with the Pokemon formula, introducing action elements while maintaining the series' core identity. As we drift a little deeper tonight, starter Pokemon emerge as one of the most iconic categories, the first Pokemon that trainers receive at the beginning of their journey. Starters are always presented as a choice between three Pokemon representing grass, fire, and water types, creating a fundamental decision that shapes the early game experience. These Pokemon become partners and teammates, often remaining on teams throughout entire playthroughs despite being available at the very start. The grass-fire-water triangle creates a balanced type advantage system where each starter is strong against one and weak against another. This design ensures that no starter is objectively better, making the choice one of preference rather than optimization. Players choose based on design, type favoritism, or strategic considerations, and all three options remain viable throughout the game. This balance respects player agency, allowing genuine choice without punishing decisions. Starter Pokémon almost always follow a three-stage evolution pattern, growing from small and cute into large and powerful forms. This evolutionary arc mirrors the player's journey from novice trainer to champion, creating parallel growth between character and Pokémon. The final evolution often occurs around the time players are challenging the Elite Four, timing the power spike to coincide with the game's climax. This pacing reinforces the emotional bond between trainer and starter as they achieve their final forms together during the most challenging battles. Each generation introduces 3 new starters with unique designs and type combinations, providing fresh experiences for returning players. Some starters gain secondary types upon evolution, like Charizard becoming Fire Flying or Torterra becoming Grass Ground, while others remain pure typed throughout their evolutionary lines. These secondary types add strategic depth, creating new strengths and weaknesses that influence how the starter functions in battle. They also provide variety, ensuring that even starters sharing the same primary type feel distinct across generations. Starter Pokémon receive special treatment in terms of power level and move pool, typically having higher base stat totals than most early game Pokémon. Their stats are distributed to support specific roles, with attackers like Blaziken having high attack and speed, while defensive options like Torterra emphasize HP and defense. This variation ensures that all 3 starters can succeed in different team compositions and play styles, supporting aggressive, defensive, or balanced approaches depending on player preference. The rarity of starter Pokémon adds to their value, as they cannot be found in wild encounters and are typically given only once per playthrough. This scarcity makes starters feel special, unique partners that cannot be easily replaced if released or traded away. Trading remains the primary method to obtain starters not chosen at the beginning, encouraging interaction between players and creating a trading economy around these coveted Pokémon. The restriction that also gives weight to the initial choice, making it a decision that carries consequences throughout the playthrough. Gender ratios for starter Pokémon are heavily skewed toward males, with only a 12.5% chance of receiving a female starter. This ratio makes female starters extremely rare and valuable, particularly for breeders who need female Pokémon to pass down species when breeding. The rarity of female starters creates additional challenge for players attempting to breed more starters or obtain specific natures and abilities. Some trainers reset their games repeatedly at the start just to obtain a female starter, demonstrating the dedication that this rarity inspires. Signature moves often accompany starter Pokémon, unique attacks that only that evolutionary line can learn. These moves reinforce the starter's identity and provide exclusive tools that set them apart from other Pokémon sharing their type. Frenzy Plant, Blast Burn, and Hydro Cannon serve as the ultimate moves for fully evolved grass, fire, and water starters respectively, powerful attacks that require recharging after use. These moves create memorable moments in battle, high-risk, high-reward options that can turn the tide when used strategically. The starter choice has inspired passionate debates among fans, with players defending their favorites and arguing about which starter is strongest or best designed. These discussions demonstrate the emotional investment that players develop toward their starters, viewing them not just as game pieces, but as companions and representations of their journey. The debates are subjective by design, as the balanced nature of starter Pokémon ensures that all options are viable, making preferences matters of taste rather than objective superiority. Starter Pokémon appear prominently in Pokémon media beyond the games, featuring as main characters in the anime and manga. Ash's Pikachu, while not technically a traditional starter, filled that role in the show, while other characters used Charizard, Greninja, and other starter evolutions as signature Pokémon. This media presence reinforces the importance of starters in the franchise's identity, making them recognizable even to people who have never played the games. They serve as ambassadors for Pokémon as a whole, representing the series in merchandise, marketing, and crossover appearances. Pseudo-legendary Pokémon form an unofficial category of powerful, rare Pokémon with specific stat requirements and 3-stage evolutionary lines. These Pokémon are not officially designated as pseudo-legendaries by the games, but the term emerged from fan communities to describe Pokémon meeting certain criteria. To qualify as a pseudo-legendary, a Pokémon must have a basis stat total of exactly 600, must be part of a 3-stage evolutionary line, and must evolve at level 50 or later. Dragonite established the pseudo-legendary template in Generation 1, serving as the final evolution of Dratini and Dragonair. Its 600 base stat total and late evolution level made it significantly stronger than most other Pokémon available during normal gameplay. Dragonite became a staple of competitive teams, its high stats and versatile move pool making it effective in various roles. The success of this design led to similar Pokémon appearing in subsequent generations, creating a pattern that players came to expect and anticipate. Each generation introduces one pseudo-legendary line, maintaining consistency in their availability and power level. Tyranitar, Salamence, Metagross, Garchomp, Hydreigon, Goodra, Kommo-o, and Dragapult all follow this pattern, appearing as rare encounters in late-game areas with evolution levels that delay their full power until after the main story. This consistency allows players to plan around obtaining and raising these Pokémon, knowing that the effort required will be rewarded with a powerful team member. The late evolution level of pseudo-legendaries creates a training challenge, requiring patience and dedication to reach their final forms. Players must invest significant time raising a relatively weak first stage Pokémon through its awkward middle evolution before finally unlocking the powerful final form. This delayed gratification makes the evolution feel earned, a reward for commitment rather than an easy power boost. The moment when a pseudo-legendary finally evolves becomes memorable, a payoff for hours of training and experience grinding. Most pseudo-legendaries are dragon type or have dragon as a secondary type, continuing the tradition established by Dragonite and Salamence. This typing reinforces their status as powerful, rare creatures associated with strength and difficulty to obtain. The dragon type itself carries prestige within the Pokémon world, historically being associated with strong trainers like champions and dragon-type specialists. Pseudo-legendaries embody this prestige, serving as accessible alternatives to actual legendary Pokémon with similar power levels. The 600 base stat total places pseudo-legendaries just below legendary Pokémon in raw power, creating a tier of extremely strong Pokémon that can still be used in most competitive formats without restrictions. Unlike legendary Pokémon, which are often banned or limited, pseudo-legendaries face fewer restrictions, making them popular choices for competitive teams. Their power level is high enough to compete with legends while remaining accessible enough to use in standard battles, creating a sweet spot that maximizes both strength and usability. Stat distributions vary among pseudo-legendaries, with some emphasizing physical attack, like Metagross and Garchomp, while others focus on special attack, like Hydreigon and Goodra. This variety ensures that pseudo-legendaries fill different roles and playstyles, preventing them from all functioning identically, despite sharing the same base stat total. Trainers can choose pseudo-legendaries that complement their team composition, selecting physical attackers, special attackers, or mixed attackers depending on their needs. The rarity of pseudo-legendaries enhances their appeal as they typically appear in late-game locations with low encounter rates. Finding the first stage evolution often requires searching specific areas or meeting certain conditions, making the discovery feel like an achievement. Some pseudo-legendaries are locked behind post-game content or require special methods to encounter, further emphasizing their status as rare and valuable Pokémon worth the effort to obtain. Pseudo-legendaries often feature prominently in competitive battling, with their high stats and versatile move pools making them threats that opponents must prepare for. Garchomp dominated the metagame for multiple generations before being banned to Ubers in some formats, demonstrating the power level that well-designed pseudo-legendaries can achieve. Even those that are not top-tier threats remain viable options, their 600 base stat total ensuring they always have the raw power to compete if played correctly. The pseudo-legendary category demonstrates the importance of unofficial fan terminology in shaping how players understand and discuss Pokémon. The games never acknowledge this category explicitly, yet players universally recognize it and use it to describe a specific subset of Pokémon with shared characteristics. This player-driven classification shows how communities can create meaningful taxonomies that enhance their understanding and enjoyment of games, filling gaps that official terminology leaves open. Before your eyes grow heavy, legendary Pokémon stand as one of the most important official categories, rare and powerful creatures that play vital roles in the Pokémon universe's lore and mythology. Legendary Pokémon are unique or extremely rare beings often associated with natural phenomena, historical events, or cosmic forces. They cannot breed through normal means, appearing in the undiscovered egg group, and most are restricted in competitive formats due to their high power levels. The category of legendary Pokémon divides into two main subcategories: major legendaries and sub-legendaries. Major legendaries are the most powerful and plot-relevant, typically appearing on game box art and serving as mascots for their respective versions. These Pokémon usually have base stat totals of 670 to 680, making them stronger than pseudo-legendaries and most other Pokémon. Zekrom, Yveltal, and Lunala exemplify major legendaries, each representing fundamental forces or concepts within their regions. Sub-legendaries are weaker than major legendaries, but stronger than most regular Pokémon, typically having base stat totals between 570 and 600. These Pokémon often appear in trios or groups, sharing thematic elements and balanced stats that make them viable for competitive play. Latios, Landorus, and Tapu Koko serve as examples of sub-legendaries, powerful Pokémon that can be used in formats where major legendaries are restricted. The distinction between major and sub-legendary Pokémon affects which competitive tiers they can participate in, with sub-legendaries generally allowed in more formats. Most legendary Pokémon cannot evolve, existing as fully realized beings from the moment they are encountered. This design choice reinforces their status as unique, powerful entities rather than creatures that grow through training. However, exceptions exist, with Cosmog and Cosmoem evolving into Solgaleo or Lunala, depending on the game version. These evolutionary legendary Pokémon are unusual within the category, creating story opportunities around growth and transformation that most legendaries do not experience. The lore surrounding legendary Pokémon often positions them as creators, guardians, or embodiments of natural forces. Kyogre controls the seas, Groudon shapes the land, and Rayquaza governs the sky, forming a trio that represents fundamental elements of the Pokémon world's geography. This mythological framing gives legendary Pokémon narrative weight beyond their battle prowess, making encounters with them feel significant in the context of the game's story. Players remember these encounters not just as difficult battles, but as climactic moments in their journey. Legendary Pokémon are typically fought only once per save file, creating high-stakes encounters where failure means reloading or continuing without that Pokémon. This scarcity encourages players to save before legendary battles and prepare carefully, bringing appropriate Pokémon, items, and strategies to maximize their chances of success. The single encounter design makes catching legendary Pokémon feel like achievements, memorable moments rather than routine captures. Shiny locked legendary Pokémon prevent certain legendaries from appearing in alternate colors, maintaining their canonical appearances across all games. This restriction frustrates shiny hunters, but ensures that story-important Pokémon appear consistently in cutscenes and promotional material. Some legendary Pokémon are not shiny locked, allowing dedicated players to soft reset thousands of times in pursuit of alternate colorations. These shiny legendary hunts represent some of the most time-intensive challenges in Pokémon, with successful encounters requiring patience and dedication. Mythical Pokémon represent an even rarer subcategory of legendary Pokémon, distinguished by their distribution methods and extreme scarcity. Mythical Pokémon are not obtainable through normal gameplay, instead requiring event distributions, mystery gifts, or special items to access. This restriction makes mythical Pokémon the rarest category in the entire series, with some distributions being limited to specific regions, time periods, or promotional events. Mew, Arceus, and Hoopa serve as iconic examples of mythical Pokémon, creatures surrounded by mystery and difficult to obtain. The event-exclusive nature of mythical Pokémon created frustration among completionists who wanted to obtain every Pokémon but lacked access to the necessary events. Regional events were particularly problematic, with some mythical Pokémon being distributed only in Japan or other specific countries, making them impossible for players in other regions to obtain legitimately. This issue persisted for many generations before being partially addressed through more widespread distribution methods and Wi-Fi events that could reach global audiences. Generation 9 changed the mythical Pokémon paradigm by making some mythicals obtainable through normal gameplay, breaking from the event-exclusive tradition that had defined the category. This shift made completing the Pokédex more achievable for players without access to events or who started playing years after distributions ended. While some purists mourned the loss of exclusivity, most players appreciated the increased accessibility and the ability to obtain these rare Pokémon through their own efforts. Mythical Pokémon typically have base stat totals of 600, matching the power level of pseudo-legendaries and sub-legendaries. This balanced stat total makes them powerful without being game-breaking, allowing them to function in competitive contexts when permitted. However, most competitive formats ban mythical Pokémon regardless of their stats, treating them the same as major legendaries in terms of restrictions. Occasional special formats allow mythicals, creating unique competitive environments where these rare Pokémon can be used. The lore surrounding mythical Pokémon often portrays them as even more mysterious and elusive than regular legendaries, appearing in ancient texts and myths, but rarely, if ever, being confirmed to exist. Mew's status as the ancestor of all Pokémon makes it fundamentally important to the series' biology, yet it remains nearly impossible to encounter. This narrative scarcity mirrors their gameplay rarity, creating consistency between story and mechanics that reinforces their mythical status. Some mythical Pokémon possess unique abilities or mechanics that set them apart even within their exclusive category. Arceus can change type using plates, effectively becoming any type and gaining access to a signature move that changes type accordingly. Hoopa has two forms with drastically different stats and roles, switching between a small mischievous form and a large threatening form. These unique mechanics make mythical Pokémon feel special beyond just their rarity, giving them gameplay identity in addition to lore significance. Mythical Pokémon distributions often coincided with movie releases or other major Pokémon media events, creating cross-promotion between games and other franchise properties. Players who attended movie screenings could receive codes or wireless distributions for mythical Pokémon tied to that film's plot. This strategy drove attendance at Pokémon movies and created collectibles that commemorated specific moments in the franchise's history. The distributions became events themselves, with players gathering at venues to obtain rare Pokémon and share the experience with other fans. Ultra Beasts form a unique category introduced in Generation 7, representing extra-dimensional Pokémon from an alternate reality called Ultra Space. These creatures are not legendary Pokémon, despite their rarity and power, existing in their own classification with distinct characteristics and lore. Ultra Beasts arrived in the Alola region through Ultra Wormholes, dimensional rifts that connected the Pokémon world to Ultra Space. Their alien designs and unusual stat distributions set them apart from traditional Pokémon, creating encounters that felt genuinely otherworldly. The Ultra Beast category includes Pokémon like Buzzwole, Nihilego, and Kartana, each with extreme stat distributions that create specialized roles. Kartana has incredibly high attack, but very low special stats, while Stakataka emphasizes defense to an absurd degree. These min-maxed stat spreads make Ultra Beasts function differently from regular Pokémon, creating glass cannons and extreme specialists that excel in specific situations but struggle in others. This design philosophy matches their alien nature, presenting them as fundamentally different from native Pokémon. Ultra Beasts have base stat totals averaging 570, placing them at the sub-legendary level of power. Some exceed this average, with Ultra Necrozma reaching higher stat totals that rival major legendaries. The variation in power levels within the category reflects the diversity of Ultra Space, suggesting multiple ecosystems and evolutionary pressures that produce different types of Ultra Beasts. This diversity makes the category feel like a collection of species rather than a single type of Pokémon. The lore surrounding Ultra Beasts frames them as invasive species accidentally transported to the Pokémon world through human activity. The plot of Sun and Moon involves capturing these displaced creatures and returning them to their home dimensions, creating a narrative about environmental responsibility and the consequences of dimensional tampering. This storyline gives Ultra Beasts sympathetic framing, portraying them as victims of circumstance rather than invaders, which adds moral complexity to their encounters. Solgaleo and Lunala, despite being legendary Pokémon, have connections to Ultra Space and can travel through Ultra Wormholes. This connection blurs the boundary between legendaries and ultra beasts, suggesting shared origins or relationships between the two categories. The games acknowledge this connection while maintaining the distinction, creating interesting lore implications about the nature of legendary Pokémon and their potential extra-dimensional origins. The trading card game classifies Duskmane, Necrozma, Dawnwing's Necrozma, and Ultra Necrozma as Ultra Beasts, despite their base form, Necrozma being a legendary Pokémon. This classification exists only in the TCG and does not reflect video game mechanics, creating a rare instance where the card game and video games diverge in their categorization. The decision likely reflects Necrozma's ability to fuse with Solgaleo and Lunala, both of which have ultra-space connections, creating forms that are mechanically and narratively linked to Ultra Beasts. Ultra Beasts were well received for their unique designs and interesting lore, providing fresh experiences in Generation 7 that differentiated it from previous games. Their presence created a sci-fi atmosphere unusual for Pokémon, exploring concepts of parallel dimensions and alien ecosystems. The category demonstrated the franchise's willingness to experiment with new concepts and push beyond traditional fantasy themes, expanding the types of stories that Pokémon games could tell. Paradox. Pokémon emerged in Generation 9 as another category of unusual Pokémon, representing either ancient ancestors or futuristic descendants of modern Pokémon. These creatures arrived in the Paldea region through a time machine located in Area 0, creating plot elements around temporal displacement and timeline manipulation. Paradox. Pokémon split into two subcategories: ancient Paradox Pokémon resembling prehistoric forms, and future Paradox Pokémon appearing as robotic or mechanized versions. Ancient Paradox Pokémon like Screamtail and Great Tusk represent what modern Pokémon might have looked like millions of years ago, before evolution shaped them into their current forms. These designs emphasize primal features, aggressive postures, and raw power, reflecting a time when survival required physical might over specialized abilities. The ancient variants often appear more savage and less refined than their modern counterparts, suggesting a harsh prehistoric environment that's selected for strength and aggression. Future Paradox. Pokémon like Iron Bundle and Iron Valiant present mechanized versions of Pokémon, suggesting a timeline where technology and biology merged to create hybrid creatures. These designs feature metallic components, mechanical joints, and futuristic aesthetics that contrast sharply with the organic appearances of traditional Pokémon. The future variants imply a world where artificial enhancement became standard, raising questions about the role of technology in Pokémon evolution. Paradox. Pokémon are genderless and cannot breed, existing in the undiscovered egg group like legendary Pokémon. This restriction reinforces their status as anomalies outside normal biological processes, creatures displaced from their proper timelines and unable to reproduce in the present. The inability to breed makes sense narratively, as these Pokémon are not meant to exist in the current era, and their presence represents temporal contamination rather than natural occurrence. All Paradox Pokémon have base stat totals of 570 and possess either the photosynthesis or quark drive ability, depending on whether they are ancient or future variants. These abilities activate in specific weather or terrain conditions, boosting the Pokémon's highest stat and creating powerful synergies with team composition. The shared ability types create mechanical consistency within the category while allowing individual Pokémon to specialize based on their stat distributions. Koraidon and Miraidon serve as box legendaries for Scarlet and Violet respectively, representing unique cases where legendary Pokémon are also Paradox Pokémon. Koraidon is the ancient paradox form of Cyclizar, while Miraidon is the future variant, creating the first instance where box legendaries are explicitly alternate timeline versions of a regular Pokémon. This design choice ties the legendary Pokémon directly into the game's time travel themes, making them central to both gameplay and narrative. The Paradox Pokémon category generated significant discussion about the ethics and consequences of time travel in the Pokémon world. The games present these creatures as scientific mistakes, beings pulled from their proper times and unable to return, forced to exist in an era that is not their own. This framing creates sympathy for the Paradox Pokémon while questioning the morality of the time machine that created the situation. The narrative acknowledges that bringing these creatures to the present was wrong, even as it allows players to catch and use them. The designs of Paradox Pokémon sparked debate among fans, with some appreciating the creative reinterpretations of familiar Pokémon and others finding the concepts executed poorly. Ancient forms were generally better received than future forms, with their primal aesthetics fitting more naturally into the Pokémon art style than the mechanical future variants. This mixed reception reflects broader disagreements about how much Pokémon should deviate from traditional organic designs when exploring science fiction themes. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where categories expand and evolve alongside the games themselves, introducing new concepts that challenge and enrich our understanding of what Pokémon can be. Each new category adds layers to the franchise, creating depth that extends beyond simple creature collection. The categories we have explored tonight represent decades of design evolution, showing how a simple concept of catching and battling creatures grew into a complex taxonomy of forms, variants, and specialized types. These categories serve practical purposes, organizing hundreds of Pokémon into manageable groups that help players understand mechanics and make informed decisions. They also serve narrative purposes, creating lore frameworks that explain why certain Pokémon are rare, powerful, or unusual. The intersection of mechanics and narrative strengthens both, creating systems that are functional and meaningful that teach players about the game while enriching the world they are playing in. The evolution of Pokémon categories reflects the changing design philosophies and technological capabilities across console generations. Early categories were simple, focused on basic distinctions like legendary versus regular or evolved versus unevolved. As hardware improved and design ambitions grew, categories became more complex and nuanced, introducing concepts like regional forms, mega evolution, and paradox Pokémon that would have been impossible in earlier games. Each category we have discussed tonight carries memories for players who encountered them during their journeys. Baby Pokémon remind us of discovering breeding mechanics for the first time, learning that Pokémon could produce eggs and that some species had infant forms. Split evolutions recall difficult choices between equally appealing options, moments where we had to commit to one path and leave another unexplored. Regional forms bring back the surprise of seeing familiar Pokémon reimagined with new types and abilities. The categories also demonstrate the franchise's commitment to accessibility and variety, ensuring that players with different preferences and playstyles can all find Pokémon that suit their needs. Competitive players gravitate towards pseudo-legendaries and legendary Pokémon with optimal stats and movesets. Casual players might prefer baby Pokémon for their cute designs or starter Pokémon for their sentimental value. Collectors pursue shiny variants and regional forms to complete their Pokédex. All these approaches are valid, and the category system supports all of them. Understanding these categories enhances appreciation for the thought and care that goes into Pokémon design. Every Pokémon belongs to multiple categories simultaneously, each classification adding a different dimension to its identity. A Pokémon might be a baby, a regional variant, and a potential shiny all at once, each label contributing to how players perceive and value it. This multi-layered classification creates richness and complexity that keeps the series engaging across multiple playthroughs and generations. The unofficial categories created by fans, like pseudo-legendary, demonstrate the active role that communities play in shaping how games are understood and discussed. Players identified patterns that developers had created but not formalized, giving names to concepts that made communication easier and analysis more precise. These fan-created categories became so widely accepted that they now appear in strategy guides, competitive rule sets, and community discussions as if they were official terms. Some categories have been retired or significantly altered as the games evolved, with mechanics like Mega Evolution and Gigantamax being introduced in one generation only to be absent in the next. These temporary categories create nostalgia for players who experience them. Memories of specific generations or those mechanics defined the metagame and shaped team-building strategies. Their absence in newer games makes them feel like historical artifacts, reminders of specific moments in the franchise's evolution. The future of Pokémon categories remains uncertain, with each new generation potentially introducing new classifications or removing old ones. Paradox Pokémon might remain unique to Generation 9, or they could become recurring elements in future games. New categories might emerge that we cannot yet imagine, introducing concepts and mechanics that change how we think about Pokémon fundamentally. The only certainty is that categories will continue to evolve alongside the games, adapting to new technologies, design philosophies, and player expectations. Categories also serve educational purposes, teaching players about biological concepts like evolution, inheritance, and adaptation through game mechanics. Baby Pokémon introduce ideas about life stages and development, while regional forms explore environmental adaptation and divergent evolution. Fossil Pokémon touch on paleontology and extinction, and Paradox Pokémon engage with speculative evolution and temporal displacement. These lessons are subtle, embedded in gameplay rather than explicitly stated, but they register nonetheless. The emotional connections that players form with Pokémon are influenced by the categories they belong to, with rare or difficult to obtain Pokémon often becoming more valued than common ones, regardless of actual power level. A shiny starter Pokémon might be treasured more than a competitively superior legendary because of the effort required to obtain it and the memories associated with that journey. These emotional valuations transcend objective analysis, creating personal hierarchies that differ from player to player. Competitive players must master category knowledge to build effective teams, understanding which Pokémon are allowed in specific formats and how different categories interact with battle mechanics. Knowing that a Pokémon is a pseudo-legendary immediately communicates information about its stat total and probable role, while recognizing Ultra Beasts suggests specific strategies to counter their extreme stat distributions. This expertise develops over time through experience and study, creating depth that rewards dedicated players. The categories we have explored represent only a fraction of the ways Pokémon can be classified and organized. Move types, abilities, egg groups, habitat classifications, and countless other systems create additional layers of organization that intersect and overlap with the categories discussed tonight. Each system adds another dimension to how Pokémon function and relate to one another, building a complex web of interactions that gives the games their strategic depth. As the Night deepens, and these thoughts drift slower. We recognize that categories are tools for understanding, frameworks that help us make sense of complexity by identifying patterns and shared characteristics. They simplify without reducing, organize without constraining, and clarify without removing mystery. The categories of Pokémon serve these functions admirably, creating a taxonomy that is both functional and meaningful, that teaches and entertains in equal measure. The journey through these categories has taken us from the smallest baby Pokémon to the most powerful legendaries, from common variants to extra-dimensional ultra beasts, from ancient fossils to future paradox forms. Each category revealed something about how Pokémon games work, how they evolved over time, and how they create experiences that resonate with millions of players worldwide. The diversity within and between categories ensures that there is always something new to discover, always another layer to appreciate. Categories create boundaries, but they also create bridges, showing how seemingly different Pokémon share common traits that unite them despite surface differences. A baby Pokémon and a legendary might seem incomparable, yet both exist in the undiscovered egg group, unable to breed through normal means. A regional form and a paradox. Pokémon both represent variations on familiar designs, exploring how environment and time shape evolutionary outcomes. These connections enrich our understanding, showing hidden relationships between Pokémon that initial appearances might obscure. The act of categorization itself reflects a human need to organize and understand the world, to create order from chaos and find patterns in complexity. Pokémon satisfies this need through its extensive taxonomy, providing endless opportunities to sort, classify, and analyze creatures according to various criteria. This satisfaction is part of the series' enduring appeal, the pleasure of discovering how things fit together and relate to one another. Tonight, we have wandered through the landscape of Pokémon categories, exploring how different types of Pokémon are defined, distinguished, and understood. We have seen how categories serve mechanical purposes, organizing game systems and creating frameworks for balance and variety. We have also seen how categories serve narrative purposes, enriching lore and creating meaningful contexts for the Pokémon we encounter and catch. The categories continue to expand and evolve with each new generation, introducing fresh concepts while maintaining connections to established patterns. This evolution ensures that the series remains dynamic and unpredictable, capable of surprising players who think they understand all its systems and classifications. The surprise of encountering a new category for the first time, of learning how it works and what it means, creates moments of discovery that keep the games engaging across decades. As we approach the end of this gentle journey, we recognize that categories are more than just labels or mechanical distinctions. They are stories about design philosophy, about how developers think about balance and variety, about how they create experiences that cater to different types of players. Each category represents decisions made by teams of designers, programmers, and artists working to create cohesive systems that function mechanically while satisfying aesthetically and narratively. The categories we have discussed tonight will continue to shape how players experience Pokémon games, influencing which creatures they choose to catch, train, and battle with. Understanding these categories enhances appreciation for the depth and complexity of the games, revealing layers of thought and design that might otherwise go unnoticed. This knowledge transforms casual play into informed engagement, where every encounter and capture carries additional meaning derived from understanding what that Pokémon represents within the larger taxonomy. Categories also create community, giving players shared language and frameworks for discussing their experiences and strategies. When trainers talk about their favorite pseudo-legendary or debate which regional form is best designed, they are using category knowledge to communicate effectively and precisely. These conversations build connections between players, creating bonds formed through shared understanding and mutual appreciation of the systems they are discussing. The future of Pokémon categories promises continued innovation and surprise as new games introduce mechanics and classifications that we cannot yet anticipate. Each generation brings opportunities to expand our understanding, to add new categories to our mental taxonomy, and discover how they interact with existing systems. This ongoing evolution ensures that Pokémon remains fresh and engaging, that even veteran players can encounter new concepts that challenge their assumptions and expand their appreciation. The intersection of categories creates interesting edge cases and unique Pokémon that belong to multiple classifications simultaneously. A shiny Alolan Raichu represents both a regional form and a color variant, combining two separate categories into a single creature. A mega-evolved pseudo-legendary like Mega Garchomp bridges the gap between form changes and high-power categories, creating temporary transformations that push already strong Pokémon to even greater heights. These intersections demonstrate the flexibility of the category system, its ability to accommodate complex combinations without breaking down. Certain categories have been more controversial than others, with fans debating their implementation, necessity, or execution. Mega Evolutions sparked arguments about power creep and whether temporary transformations belonged in Pokémon games. Regional forms divided players between those who appreciated fresh takes on old designs and those who felt the originals were being replaced. Paradox Pokémon generated discussions about whether time travel fit thematically with the series' traditional fantasy elements. These debates show how passionately players engage with categories, viewing them not just as mechanics, but as statements about what Pokémon should be. The removal or absence of categories in certain games creates nostalgia for players who experienced them. Players who loved Mega Evolution in Generations 6 and 7 felt its absence keenly when Generation 8 introduced Dynamax instead. Those who enjoyed following Pokémon in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee mourned when that feature did not return in subsequent games. Categories become associated with specific entries in the series, marking them as unique and creating distinct identities for each generation. Some categories exist only in specific media or contexts, creating variations between how Pokémon are classified in games versus anime versus trading cards. The TCG's classification of Necrozma forms as Ultra Beasts demonstrates how different Pokémon products can interpret categories differently based on their needs and design goals. These variations create interesting discrepancies that dedicated fans notice and discuss, comparing how the same Pokémon functions across different contexts. The mathematical precision behind many categories reveals the careful balancing act that developers perform when creating new Pokémon. Base stat totals of exactly 600 for pseudo-legendaries, specific level requirements for evolution, and carefully calibrated encounter rates all demonstrate intentional design choices rather than random decisions. These numbers create consistency and predictability that players can rely on, building expertise through pattern recognition and understanding of underlying systems. Categories also influence how Pokémon are marketed and presented in promotional materials, with certain categories receiving prominence based on their appeal to different demographics. Baby Pokémon feature heavily in merchandise aimed at younger audiences, their cute designs translating well to plushes and toys. Legendary Pokémon dominate game covers and movie posters, their powerful and dramatic designs creating visual impact that attracts attention. Starter's Pokémon appear consistently across all types of Pokémon products, their status as first companions, making them universally recognizable and appealing. The category of Gigantamax Pokémon, introduced in Generation 8, represents another form change mechanic, allowing specific Pokémon to grow to enormous sizes while changing form during Dynamax transformations. Gigantamax differs from regular Dynamax by altering the Pokémon's appearance and giving access to unique G-Max moves that have special effects beyond increased power. Only certain species can Gigantamax, and within those species, only specific individuals with the Gigantamax factor possess the ability, creating rarity within an already limited mechanic. Gigantamax Pokémon required special methods to obtain, either through max raid battles, where they appeared rarely, or through feeding regular Pokémon Max Soup to grant them the Gigantamax factor. This acquisition method created challenges for players seeking specific Gigantamax forms, requiring participation in raids and luck to encounter the desired species. The rarity made successful captures feel meaningful, rewarding dedication with unique Pokémon that could access special battle mechanics unavailable to regular versions. The visual spectacle of Gigantamax transformations created memorable moments in Generation 8, with Pokémon growing to massive sizes and transforming into exaggerated versions of themselves. Gigantamax Alchemy became a multi-tiered cake. Gigantamax Corviknight transformed into a flying fortress, and Gigantamax Pikachu returned to its original, chubby design from Generation 1. These transformations combine nostalgia, creativity, and visual impact to create forms that felt special and worth the effort to obtain. G-Max moves added strategic depth to Gigantamax Pokémon, providing unique attacks that combine damage with special effects like terrain setting, stat changes, or status conditions. These moves could only be accessed by Gigantamax Pokémon, creating functional differences between Gigantamax and regular Dynamax beyond just its appearance changes. The exclusive moves gave competitive value to Gigantamax forms, making them more than cosmetic variants and justifying the effort required to obtain them. The Gigantamax mechanic lasted only for Generation 8, being absent from Generation 9's games, making it a temporary category specific to Galar region games. This limited lifespan created a sense of urgency among players to obtain and use Gigantamax Pokémon while they were current content, knowing that future games might not support the mechanic. The removal in Generation 9 led to discussions about whether generational gimmicks were sustainable or if the series should return to permanent mechanics that persist across multiple games. Totem-sized Pokémon could be obtained after defeating the actual totem Pokémon in certain post-game content, allowing players to own these larger variants permanently. The size difference was purely cosmetic in player hands, not providing the stat boosts or ally calling abilities that made totem Pokémon challenging during trial battles. However, the size difference was noticeable enough to create visual appeal, making these Pokémon desirable for collectors who appreciated the unique attribute even without mechanical benefits. The concept of size variations has appeared in multiple forms throughout the series, from totem Pokémon to alpha Pokémon to simply random size differences that have no mechanical impact. These size variations add another layer of diversity to Pokémon populations, suggesting that even within a species, individuals vary in physical attributes. Some players seek out the largest or smallest versions of their favorite Pokémon, creating collecting goals beyond shiny hunting or perfect stats. Form differences based on environment or items have created some of the most mechanically diverse Pokémon in the series. Rotom's appliance forms each have different secondary types and signature moves, effectively creating 5 different Pokémon from one base species. Similarly, Arceus's plate forms allow it to become any type, making it the most versatile Pokémon in terms of type coverage and adaptation. These form-changing mechanics reward players who experiment with different items and configurations, discovering optimal combinations for their teams. Deoxys represents another extreme case of form changing, with 4 distinct forms that dramatically alter its stat distribution. Normal form provides balanced stats. Attack form maximizes offensive power. Defense form emphasizes bulk, and speed form prioritizes going first. These forms allow Deoxys to fill completely different roles depending on which form is selected, creating a single Pokémon that can function as a sweeper, wall, or speed demon, depending on player needs. Certain Pokémon have forms that change based on time of day, weather, or battle conditions, creating dynamic appearances that shift during gameplay. Cherrim transforms from its overcast form to sunshine form in harsh sunlight, opening its petals and changing its appearance dramatically. Castform's weather forms activate automatically when weather conditions change, making it a living barometer that reflects current battle conditions. These automatic form changes add visual variety to battles and create immersive experiences where Pokémon respond visibly to their environments. The Alchemy line showcases perhaps the most diverse form variations in the series, with 63 different combinations of cream color, sweet decoration, and size, creating unique appearances. These variations result from specific evolution methods involving spinning, time of day, and held items, creating a complex system that rewards experimentation and discovery. Collectors seeking every Alchemy variant face a significant challenge, requiring multiple playthroughs or extensive trading to obtain those all combinations. Vivillon's wing patterns vary based on the real-world geographic location where the game is played, creating regional diversity tied to actual geography rather than in-game regions. This innovation connected the virtual Pokémon world to physical reality, encouraging trading between players in different countries to collect all 20 wing patterns. The mechanic demonstrated creative thinking about how global connectivity could enhance collecting aspects and create value in trading beyond just filling Pokédex entries. Spinda represents an extreme case of variation, with its spot pattern being determined by a 32-bit personality value that creates over 4 billion possible unique appearances. While these variations are subtle and difficult to distinguish without close examination, the mathematical reality that virtually every Spinda is visually unique adds conceptual appeal. The mechanic demonstrates how randomization can create perceived uniqueness even when functional differences do not exist. Unknown has 28 different forms corresponding to letters of the alphabet plus question mark and exclamation point symbols, creating a Pokémon explicitly designed around collecting variations. The forms have no mechanical differences, being functionally identical in stats, moves, and abilities, but their visual diversity and letter theme made them appealing to collectors nonetheless. The Unknown forms inspired one of the first widespread collecting challenges in Pokémon, with players seeking to spell words or complete the full alphabet using these mysterious creatures. Gender differences, while often subtle, have created collecting goals for players who want both versions of dimorphic species. Some differences are barely noticeable, like the size of Pikachu's tail or the whiskers on Meowstic, while others are dramatic, like the color difference in Hippopotas or the completely different appearances of male and female Pyroar. These variations add biological realism to the Pokémon world while providing mild collecting incentives that do not impact battle functionality. Evolution items have created categories of Pokémon that can only evolve through specific stones, held items, or other special methods. Stone evolutions date back to Generation 1, with Firestone, Waterstone, Thunderstone, Leafstone, and Moonstone all providing evolution methods for specific Pokémon. These evolution stones created permanent item sinks and gave players control over when certain Pokémon evolved, allowing them to delay evolution to learn moves earlier or evolve immediately for stat boosts. Trait evolutions represent another method category, with certain Pokémon requiring trading to evolve regardless of level. This mechanic encouraged social interaction and cooperation between players, making evolution a collaborative achievement rather than a solo endeavor. However, trait evolutions also created barriers for players without trading partners or multiple game systems, leading to frustration when favorite Pokémon could not reach their final forms without an outside help. Generation 4 introduced held item trade evolutions, requiring specific items to be held during trading for evolution to occur. This added complexity to trade evolutions, creating additional requirements beyond simple trading and making certain items valuable for their role in evolution chains. The mechanic also allowed for split evolutions based on trade items, with Pokémon like Clamperl evolving into different forms depending on whether it held a deep-sea tooth or deep-sea scale during trading. Location-based evolutions emerged as another category, with Pokémon requiring evolution in specific places or near special rocks to trigger transformation. Leafeon and Glaceon needed exposure to Moss Rock or Ice Rock respectively, creating exploration incentives and tying evolution to world geography. Magnezone and Probopass evolved when leveled near special magnetic fields in certain locations, connecting their electric and steel typing to environmental factors. These location requirements added complexity to evolution while encouraging exploration of game worlds. Time-based evolutions created day and night categories for certain Pokémon, with Eevee evolving into Espeon during day and Umbreon at night when leveled with high friendship. This mechanic connected in-game time systems to evolution, making certain transformations available only during specific play periods. Players had to pay attention to time of day and plan their training sessions accordingly, adding temporal awareness to the evolution process. Friendship-based evolutions require high happiness values, mechanically enforcing the series' themes about bonds between trainers and Pokémon. These evolutions cannot occur through simple level grinding. They require care, attention, and positive interactions that raise happiness values. The mechanic creates meaningful connections between gameplay actions and evolution outcomes, rewarding players who treat their Pokémon well with evolutionary progression. Move-based evolutions introduced requirements for knowing specific moves before evolution can occur, creating learning challenges for players. Tangela must know Ancient Power to evolve into Tangrowth, while Piloswine needs to learn that same move to become Mamoswine. These requirements encourage players to explore move pools and learn which moves trigger evolution, adding knowledge checks to the evolution process. Stat-based evolutions create unique requirements tied to Pokémon attributes, with Tyrogue evolving into different forms depending on whether its attack or defense is higher or equal. This mechanic connects training choices to evolution outcomes, rewarding players who understand stat mechanics and train deliberately towards specific stat distributions. The system adds strategy to raising certain Pokémon, making evolution more complex than simple level thresholds. Turn Your Device evolutions appeared in Generation 5 and beyond, requiring players to physically invert their game systems during level up to trigger evolution. NK must be leveled while the device is held upside down to evolve into Malamar, creating a gimmick evolution that connects a physical action to in-game results. This mechanic demonstrated creative thinking about how handheld gaming systems could interact with game mechanics in unexpected ways. Beauty-based evolution affected Phoebus, which required maximum beauty condition, stat in Generations 3 and 4, to evolve into Melodic. This created a minigame around raising Phoebus through contests and feeding it specific Pokeblocks or Poffins to increase its beauty. The mechanic was eventually changed to friendship-based evolution in later generations, simplifying the process but removing some of the unique challenge that made Melodic feel special to obtain. Weather-based evolutions created atmospheric requirements, with Sliggoo needing to level during rain to evolve into Goodra. This requirement connected weather systems to evolution, encouraging players to wait for specific conditions or battle in locations with permanent rain. The mechanic added environmental awareness to the evolution process, making weather a factor beyond just battle effects. 3-segment party requirements emerged with Maushold, which evolves from Tandemaus at level 25, but can result in either family of 3 or family of 4 forms randomly. The evolution itself is straightforward, but the form outcome is chance-based, creating mild collecting challenges for players who want the specific family size. This randomness within evolution creates unpredictability that keeps the process interesting even for veteran players. Slowly, the story widens once more as we consider how different categories interact with competitive battling and metagame development. Categories like pseudo-legendary and sub-legendary are defined partly by their viability in competitive play, their stats calibrated to create threats that shape team building and strategy development. Understanding which categories are allowed in specific formats becomes essential knowledge for competitive players, informing every team composition decision. The ban list system in competitive play often correlates directly with categories, with legendary and mythical Pokémon typically restricted or banned while regular Pokémon remain legal. This creates tiers of play where categories determine access, with Ubers allowing legendary Pokémon while OU restricts them. The category-based restrictions create different competitive environments, allowing players to engage with different power levels and strategic depths depending on which format they choose. Usage-based tiering systems like Smogons create dynamic categories that shift as metagames evolve, with Pokémon moving between OU, UU, RU, NU, and PU based on usage statistics. These categories are unofficial and community-created, existing parallel to official classifications and providing additional organizational structures for competitive play. The interaction between official categories like legendary status and unofficial categories like tier placement creates complex classification systems that dedicated players must master. Some Pokémon exist in unusual category positions, being officially classified in ways that seem inconsistent with their stats or lore. Arcanine's Pokédex category is Legendary Pokémon, despite it not being a legendary Pokémon in mechanical terms, creating confusion about its status. This category discrepancy demonstrates how in-universe classifications can differ from gameplay classifications, adding flavor text that does not necessarily reflect mechanical reality. Mythical Pokémon occupy an awkward position in competitive play, being powerful enough to compete with legendaries, but often excluded from formats where they would be allowed based on stats alone. Their event-exclusive status historically created fairness concerns, as not all players had access to them, leading to blanket bans regardless of power level. As mythicals become more accessible through normal gameplay, their competitive status may shift, potentially integrating them into formats where they were previously excluded. Ultra Beasts created unique competitive considerations with their extreme stat distributions, requiring specific strategies to counter effectively. Their specialized stats made them dominant in certain situations, but vulnerable in others, creating matchup-dependent gameplay where team composition significantly affected their effectiveness. The category demonstrated how unique stat philosophies could create fresh competitive dynamics that differed from traditional Pokémon. Paradox Pokémon have rapidly become competitively relevant, with their strong stats and powerful signature abilities making them threats in current generation formats. The photosynthesis and quark drive abilities create auto-boosting effects that activate under appropriate conditions, eliminating setup turns and allowing an immediate offensive pressure. This efficiency makes Paradox Pokémon attractive for fast-paced competitive matches where setup time is vulnerable. Form-changing Pokémon, like Aegislash, create unique competitive challenges, with their ability to switch between offensive and defensive modes mid-battle, adding complexity to prediction and counterplay. These form changes must be accounted for when planning strategies, as a Pokémon's stats and capabilities can shift dramatically from turn to turn. The dynamic nature of form changes keeps battles unpredictable and rewards players who understand the mechanics and can anticipate transformations. Mega Evolution created centralized metagames where teams were built around specific Mega Pokémon, with other team members supporting the Mega through entry hazards, wall breakers, or speed control. The temporary nature and one per team limit forced strategic decisions about which Pokémon would receive the Mega Evolution, creating team composition challenges that rewarded thoughtful planning. The removal of Mega Evolution in Generation 8 disrupted established team structures, forcing players to adapt to new mechanics and strategies. The impact of categories on casual play differs significantly from competitive implications, with most casual players never considering tier placements or ban lists. Categories, like baby Pokémon and regional forms, appeal to casual audiences through design and accessibility rather than battle viability. This creates parallel value systems where different categories matter depending on how players engage with the games. Collecting challenges often revolve around category completion, with players seeking to obtain at least one Pokémon from every category or every variant within specific categories, completing all evolutions, obtaining every regional form, or catching representatives of every legendary type creates structured goals that extend gameplay beyond the main story. These category-based challenges provide direction and purpose for players who might otherwise lose interest after defeating the Elite Four. Some categories exist primarily in supplementary materials or spin-off games, creating classifications that do not appear in main series titles. Pokémon Ranger introduced ranger signs corresponding to Pokémon types, while Pokémon Mystery Dungeon created personality-based type assignments through quiz systems. These alternative category systems demonstrate how different Pokémon games can create unique organizational structures suited to their specific gameplay needs. The Pokédex itself represents a category system, organizing Pokémon by region and national number to create searchable databases of species information. Regional Pokédexes prioritize Pokémon native to specific areas, creating focused collections that guide players through designed progressions of encounters and captures. The National Pokédex provides comprehensive organization across all regions, creating a master list that dedicated completionists work to fill entirely. Color-based Pokédex searching introduced categories based on dominant hues, allowing players to find Pokémon by visual characteristics rather than type or name. This alternative organization system acknowledges that players remember Pokémon through different attributes, providing multiple pathways to finding specific species. The color categories are subjective and sometimes debatable, adding personality to what could have been purely functional organization. Habitat-based categories emerged in certain Pokédex implementations, organizing Pokémon by where they are typically found rather than biological characteristics. Cave Pokémon, sea Pokémon, forest Pokémon, and urban Pokémon create ecological classifications that reflect environmental adaptation and behavioral patterns. These habitat categories help players understand where to search for specific Pokémon and create mental maps of ecosystem diversity. Body type categories appeared in Pokémon storage systems, classifying Pokémon by physical structure, such as bipedal, quadrupedal, serpentine, or amorphous. These categories facilitate organization in boxes, allowing players to sort their collections by appearance-based criteria. The body types also appear in certain gameplay mechanics, affecting which Pokémon can use specific moves or abilities tied to physical structure. Generation-based categories create historical classifications, with Pokémon grouped by when they were introduced to the series. Gen 1 Pokémon carry nostalgia value and original design philosophy, while newer generations introduce modern mechanics and design sensibilities. These generational categories create community identities, with players often favoring Pokémon from generations they played during formative years. The category of Pokémon with signature moves creates a subset of species with exclusive attacks that define their battle identity. These signature moves often reflect the Pokémon's concept or typing in exaggerated form, providing thematic attacks that feel uniquely appropriate. The exclusivity makes these Pokémon feel special, possessing tools that no other species can access even with move tutors or TMs. Ability categories create classifications based on shared passive effects, with weather-setting abilities, terrain-creating abilities, and stat-boosting abilities, each forming distinct groups. These ability-based categories influence team building and strategy, with certain abilities being essential for specific team archetypes. Understanding ability categories becomes crucial for competitive play, where ability choice can determine matchup results. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where systems within systems create depth that rewards attention and study. The category structures we have explored tonight exist in layers, each classification adding dimension to how Pokémon are understood, valued, and utilized. These frameworks are both discovered and created, emerging from official design while being refined and expanded through community engagement and interpretation. The future evolution of categories remains uncertain but inevitable, with each new generation bringing opportunities for innovation and expansion. New mechanics will create new categories, whether form changes, regional variants, temporal displacements, or concepts not yet imagined. The category system's flexibility allows it to accommodate these additions without breaking, integrating new classifications while maintaining coherence with existing structures. Categories provide structure to a franchise containing over 1,000 unique creatures, creating organizational frameworks that prevent overwhelming complexity. Without categories, the sheer number of Pokémon would become difficult to navigate and understand, a vast collection with no coherent internal logic. Categories create pathways through this abundance, allowing players to find what interests them and understand how different Pokémon relate to broader patterns. The educational value of categories extends beyond gameplay mechanics into general cognitive development, teaching pattern recognition, classification skills, and systematic thinking. Young players learn to identify shared characteristics, group similar things together, and then understand how individual examples fit into larger patterns. These transferable skills develop naturally through engagement with Pokémon categories, creating learning opportunities disguised as entertainment. The social aspects of categories create shared language and reference points for communities, allowing players to communicate efficiently about complex topics through established terminology. When someone mentions pseudo-legendaries, that single word conveys information about stats, evolution levels, rarity, and competitive viability without requiring lengthy explanation. This linguistic efficiency strengthens communities by making discussion more accessible and precise. Categories also create hierarchies of knowledge, with casual understanding of basic categories like starter and legendary being accessible to everyone, while deeper knowledge of unofficial categories and subtle distinctions marking more dedicated players. This tiered knowledge structure allows the community to accommodate players at all levels of engagement, providing entry points for newcomers while rewarding veterans who invest time in mastering complex systems. The permanence of categories varies across the series, with some persisting since Generation 1, while others exist only in specific games or generations. This impermanence creates historical markers, with categories like Mega Evolution defining specific eras of the franchise before being retired or replaced. These temporal boundaries help players organize their memories of different games, associating mechanics and categories with particular moments in the series' evolution. Certain categories carry cultural significance beyond their mechanical functions, representing concepts or themes that resonate with players on emotional or philosophical levels. Baby Pokémon represent innocence and childhood, mythical Pokémon embody mystery and the unknown, and legendary Pokémon symbolize power and significance. These symbolic dimensions add depth to categories, making them meaningful beyond just organizational convenience. The intersection of official and unofficial categories creates interesting dynamics where fan terminology sometimes becomes more widely used than official classifications. Terms like pseudo-legendary have no official status, but are universally understood and employed by competitive communities, strategy guides, and even casual players. This demonstrates how player communities can create meaningful categories that fill gaps in official taxonomy, contributing to the franchise's conceptual framework. As we drift toward the end of this gentle exploration, we recognize that categories are living systems, constantly evolving as new games introduce fresh concepts and mechanics. They are both descriptive, naming what exists, and prescriptive, shaping how players think about and engage with Pokémon. The categories we have discussed tonight form a framework that organizes complexity while allowing for creativity, that provides structure while permitting discovery. The journey through Pokémon categories reveals a franchise that has grown more complex and nuanced over time, adding layers of classification that deepen engagement without fundamentally changing core experiences. Categories enhance the games by providing organizational logic, creating collecting goals, enabling strategic depth, and enriching lore. They serve multiple purposes simultaneously, being both functional and meaningful, mechanical and thematic. Understanding categories enhances appreciation for the thought and care invested in Pokémon design across generations and development teams. Every category represents decisions about balance, accessibility, variety, and player experience, reflecting values about what makes Pokémon engaging and enjoyable. These decisions that compound across categories, creating a system that is greater than the sum of its parts, the categories continue to invite exploration and discovery, with new players encountering them for the first time, while veterans find fresh perspectives through revisiting familiar concepts. This spaceless quality ensures that category knowledge remains relevant and valuable regardless of when players join the franchise or which generation they started with. The foundational nature of categories means they transcend individual games, providing continuity across the entire series. As sleep draws nearer and thoughts drift slower still, we carry with us a deeper understanding of how Pokémon are organized, classified, and understood. The categories we have explored are not just labels, but frameworks for experiencing one of gaming's most enduring franchises. They are tools for understanding, lenses for appreciation, and bridges connecting millions of players through shared language and knowledge. The relationship between categories and competitive metagames creates dynamic interactions where category membership influences tier placement and usage rates. Pseudo-legendaries naturally gravitate toward higher tiers due to their 600 base stat totals, while baby Pokémon typically languish in lower tiers despite occasional niche uses. Understanding these category tier correlations helps players predict which Pokémon will be competitively viable and which will require creative strategies to use effectively. Category-based team archetypes emerge in competitive play, with strategies built around specific combinations of categories working together synergistically. Weather teams combine Pokémon with weather-setting abilities and weather-dependent mechanics, creating cohesive units where category memberships align with strategic goals. Trick Room teams utilize slow Pokémon from various categories to exploit speed reversal, demonstrating how categories can be mixed creatively to produce unexpected competitive advantages. The role of categories in shaping player identity manifests through favorite Pokémon choices and team composition preferences. Some players gravitate towards specific categories based on aesthetic preferences, building teams composed entirely of dragon types or ghost types, regardless of competitive optimization. Others organize teams around mechanical categories, using only Pokémon with specific abilities or move types to create thematic coherence. These personal category preferences create individual playstyles and identities within the broader player community. Trading card game categories sometimes diverge from video game classifications, creating parallel taxonomies that serve different gameplay needs. The TCG introduces mechanics like tag team cards, V cards, and VMAX cards that have no direct video game equivalents, while also reinterpreting existing categories like Ultra Beasts through card-specific mechanics. These differences demonstrate how the same intellectual property can support a classification, systems optimized for different game formats. Spin-off games create their own category systems tailored to their specific mechanics and gameplay styles. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon categorizes Pokémon by personality types and dungeon roles rather than competitive battle statistics, while Pokémon Go introduces categories like Shadow Pokémon and Purified Pokémon unique to that mobile experience. These alternative categorizations show how flexible the Pokémon concept is, adapting to various gameplay contexts while maintaining core identity. The anime's treatment of categories often simplifies or ignores game mechanics in favor of narrative coherence and character development. Legendary Pokémon appear more frequently in the anime than their game rarity suggests, while evolution mechanics are presented inconsistently to serve story needs. This divergence creates separate continuities where categories function differently, allowing each medium to prioritize its own strengths rather than maintaining strict cross-media consistency. Merchandise categories create commercial classifications based on popularity and marketability rather than gameplay mechanics. Pikachu and Eevee receive disproportionate merchandise representation despite not belonging to particularly powerful or rare game categories, while many legendary Pokémon appear frequently in promotional materials due to their impressive designs. These commercial categories reflect consumer preferences and marketing strategies rather than in-game classifications. The educational applications of Pokémon categories extend into formal learning environments, where teachers use the games to teach biological classification, statistical analysis, and strategic thinking. Students learn Linnaean taxonomy concepts through egg groups and evolutionary relationships, while math classes use IV breeding probability to teach genetics and statistics. The game mechanics become pedagogical tools, transforming entertainment software into educational resources. Accessibility features in modern games interact with categories in interesting ways, with the options like experience share affecting how quickly Pokémon reach evolution levels and whether training multiple team members remains feasible. These features can trivialize some category-based challenges while making others more accessible to players with less time or different ability levels. The balance between challenge and accessibility remains contentious, with different players preferring different approaches to category completion. The preservation of legacy categories across generations demonstrates respect for franchise history while creating continuity that longtime fans appreciate. Starter Pokémon maintain their 3-type triangle and 3-stage evolution patterns across all generations, creating reliable expectations that new games fulfill. This consistency creates comfort and familiarity, allowing players to approach new generations with understanding built from previous experiences. Innovation within established categories shows how developers introduce freshness while maintaining recognizable patterns. Regional forms reimagine existing Pokémon through new types and designs, while Paradox Pokémon explore temporal variations on familiar species. These innovations prevent categories from becoming stale, while respecting the foundations that make them recognizable and meaningful. The storytelling potential of categories enables narrative exploration of themes like artificial versus natural life through Pokémon like Mewtwo and type, Null, or the consequences of environmental change through regional forms adapted to different climates. Categories become vehicles for examining complex ideas in accessible frameworks, using fictional creatures to explore real-world concepts and ethical questions. Historical Pokémon categories like Missing No and other glitch Pokémon exist in a liminal space between official classifications and unintended game states. These accidental categories emerge from programming errors and exploits, creating unofficial creatures that players discover and share despite lacking developer sanction. The cultural impact of glitch Pokémon demonstrates how player communities can create meaningful categories independent of official design. The competitive infrastructure built around categories includes detailed tier systems, usage statistics, and ban lists that create organized competitive environments. Smogon's tier system divides Pokémon into OU, UU, RU, NU, and PU based on usage rates, creating competitive categories that shift monthly as metagames evolve. This community-driven classification exists parallel to official categories, demonstrating how player organizations can create sophisticated taxonomies serving specialized needs. The seasonal nature of some categories creates cyclical engagement patterns where players return to games during specific events or seasons to access temporarily available Pokémon. This design strategy maintains player bases across years rather than months, creating long-term engagement through periodic content refreshes. The seasonal approach respects player time, while providing reasons to revisit games regularly. Category completion achievements and rewards incentivize thorough engagement with classification systems, offering tangible gameplay benefits for completing Pokédexes or collecting all members of specific categories. Shiny charms increase shiny encounter rates for players who complete regional Pokédexes, while catching all legendary Pokémon might unlock special facilities or encounters. These rewards create positive feedback loops where category engagement generates tools that make further category exploration easier or more rewarding. The philosophical implications of categorizing living creatures into rigid taxonomies raise questions about essentialism and the limitations of classification systems. Pokémon resist simple categorization through mechanics like form changes, type shifts, and evolution, demonstrating that living beings exceed the categories used to describe them. This tension between classification utility and individual uniqueness mirrors real-world debates about taxonomy and identity. Fan-made categories emerge from community observation and analysis, creating unofficial classifications like early game birds or Route 1 rodents that identify patterns in game design across generations. These categories recognize developer habits and design templates that repeat across games, creating meta-knowledge about how Pokémon games are structured beyond explicit classifications. The community-created nature of these categories shows active engagement with game design rather than passive consumption. The economic impact of categories manifests in real-world markets where rare category Pokémon cards, merchandise, or event distributions command premium prices. Shiny legendary Pokémon from limited distributions become valuable commodities, while complete category collections of cards or figures attract collector interest. These economic dimensions extend category significance beyond virtual gameplay into material value and investment. The psychological satisfaction of category completion taps into human desires for order, achievement, and mastery. Completing a Pokédex or collecting every shiny starter creates measurable accomplishment feelings that games deliberately cultivate through rewards and recognition. The category structure enables these satisfaction mechanics, providing clear goals with definitive completion states. Cross-generational category evolution demonstrates how classifications adapt to accommodate new mechanics and design philosophies without abandoning core concepts. Mega Evolution introduced temporary transformations to existing categories, while regional forms created permanent variants, and Gigantamax combined elements of both approaches. This iterative design process refines category concepts across multiple attempts, learning from previous implementations. The role of categories in creating accessible entry points for new players cannot be overstated, with starter Pokémon providing guaranteed strong teammates and legendary Pokémon offering clear late-game goals. These category waypoints guide player progression through designed experiences, preventing overwhelming choice paralysis while maintaining enough freedom for personal expression. Some categories exist primarily for mechanical balance rather than thematic coherence, with egg groups and stat distributions serving gameplay needs first and logical consistency second. This pragmatic approach prioritizes functional game systems over realistic simulation, accepting that entertainment value sometimes requires compromising logical coherence. The willingness to prioritize fun over realism shapes how categories function and what purposes they serve. The storytelling through Pokédex entries creates narrative categories based on behavioral patterns, habitats, or ecological roles described in species descriptions. Predator Pokémon, prey Pokémon, nocturnal species, and social pack hunters all emerge from Pokédex flavor text rather than explicit mechanical classifications. These narrative categories enrich world building by suggesting complex ecosystems and food chains beyond what gameplay directly simulates. The integration of categories with game geography creates region-specific taxonomies where certain categories appear predominantly in particular locations. Water. Pokémon cluster near oceans and lakes, while rock types concentrate in mountainous areas, creating environmental storytelling through distribution patterns. This geographical categorization makes worlds feel cohesive and realistic, with species appearing in appropriate habitats. Weather and time-based categories interact with real-world player schedules in ways that can exclude certain demographics from accessing time-exclusive content. Players who work night shifts might rarely encounter day-exclusive Pokémon naturally, while those with limited play windows might miss weather-dependent spawns. This accessibility tension between design ambition and player convenience remains an ongoing consideration in category implementation. The longevity of Pokémon categories demonstrates successful design that remains engaging across decades of iteration and expansion. Categories introduced in Generation 1 still functioned in Generation 9, adapted and updated, but recognizably continuous with their original implementations. This longevity creates franchise stability while allowing innovation within established frameworks. Memory and nostalgia color how players perceive categories, with Generation 1 Pokémon holding special significance for many players regardless of their current competitive viability or design sophistication. These emotional attachments create personal hierarchies that diverge from objective analysis, demonstrating how categories gain meaning through individual experience rather than just mechanical properties. The future potential of categories includes possible innovations like 4-stage evolution lines, new type combinations, creating novel category possibilities, or mechanical innovations that create entirely new classification needs. Speculation about future categories generates community discussion and excitement, showing how categories themselves become content beyond their immediate gameplay functions. As these thoughts drift slower through the deepening night, we recognize that categories serve as both mirrors and maps, reflecting player values while guiding exploration through complex game systems. They organize without over-determining, providing structure that enables rather than restricts creative engagement. The categories we have explored tonight represent decades of iterative design, community input, and evolving understanding of what makes Pokémon engaging across age groups and play styles. The teaching function of categories extends beyond explicit tutorials into implicit learning through pattern recognition and experimentation. Players intuitively grasp category concepts through gameplay exposure, developing understanding that becomes second nature without conscious study. This organic learning process makes category knowledge feel earned rather than imposed, creating ownership and expertise that enhances enjoyment. The social bonding enabled by shared category knowledge creates community cohesion through common language and reference points. Discussing favorite pseudo-legendaries or debating which regional forms are best designed builds connections between strangers united by shared interests. These conversations transform categories from game mechanics into social currency, facilitating relationships and community formation. The artistic expression within categories manifests through deliberate design choices about aesthetics, themes, and mechanical implementations. Each category represents artistic vision translated into playable form, with visual designs, animations, and sound effects all contributing to category identity. Appreciating this artistry adds another dimension to category engagement beyond pure mechanical analysis. The mathematical elegance of category balance demonstrates careful calibration where power levels, availability, and utility create ecosystems of viable options rather than dominant strategies. The balance is never perfect, but the attempt to create meaningful choices within and between categories shows sophisticated understanding of game design principles. This balance makes categories feel intentional rather than arbitrary, purposeful rather than accidental. The documentation challenges of comprehensive category knowledge create opportunities for community contribution through wikis, databases, and guides that organize information into accessible formats. These community resources become essential tools for serious players, demonstrating how official categories generate unofficial supporting infrastructure. The collaborative nature of this documentation builds community while serving practical information needs. The streaming and content creation industries built around Pokémon often organize content by categories, with videos focused on shiny hunting, competitive team building with specific categories, or challenges using restricted category sets. This content categorization extends game categories into media categories, showing how classification systems propagate beyond their original contexts into derivative works. The modification and ROM hack communities create alternative category systems through game edits that introduce new types, evolution methods, or classification schemes. These fan modifications demonstrate active engagement with category design, showing community members thinking critically about how categories function and experimenting with alternatives. The creative output enriches the broader Pokémon ecosystem while showcasing deep mechanical understanding. The influence of categories on game pacing creates structured progression where certain categories become available at specific points in the journey. Starter. Pokémon Anchor. The beginning. Common route. Pokémon populate early areas, evolved forms appear in mid-game locations, and legendary Pokémon wait in endgame dungeons. This category-based pacing guides players through difficulty curves that feel natural and earned rather than arbitrary or sudden. Early game category design prioritizes accessibility and teaching, with Route 1 Pokémon typically featuring simple mechanics, clear types, and straightforward evolution patterns. These beginner-friendly categories introduce game concepts gently, allowing new players to learn battle mechanics and evolution systems through creatures designed for educational purposes. The Pidgey line, Rattata line, and similar early routes normal and flying types across generations all serve this pedagogical function. Mid-game categories increase complexity without overwhelming players who have developed basic competency through early encounters. Split evolution. Pokémon appear more frequently in mid-game areas, introducing choice and strategic consideration absent from linear early game progression. Type coverage becomes more important as trainer battles feature increasingly diverse teams requiring players to think beyond simple type advantages they mastered early. Late game and post-game categories reward mastery and dedication through rare encounters, complex evolution requirements, and powerful stats that validate the effort required to obtain them. Pseudo-legendaries typically appear late, their high-level evolution requirements ensuring players cannot access their full power until near or after the elite. 4. This reward structure creates satisfying arcs where patient investment pays off with genuinely powerful creatures. The reset culture around certain categories demonstrates how specific Pokémon inspire dedicated pursuit through save file manipulation and encounter repetition. Soft resetting for perfect IV legendary Pokémon, shiny hunting through chain encounters, and starter resets for optimal natures all represent players engaging deeply with category mechanics through repetitive play. This engagement style transforms simple encounters into elaborate rituals with community-recognized strategies and etiquette. Speedrunning communities create alternative category evaluations, where time efficiency trumps traditional power metrics, making early-game Pokémon viable if they enable faster progression. Categories that allow sequence breaking, early power spikes, or movement ability access become valuable in speedrun contexts, despite being ignored by competitive battlers. This demonstrates how different playstyles create entirely different category hierarchies, serving distinct optimization goals. The Nuzlocke challenge and similar player-imposed restrictions create temporary category relevance for Pokémon that standard play might dismiss, as permadeath rules make every encounter potentially significant. Common route: Pokémon become valued team members when replacement options are limited by challenge rules, demonstrating how context radically shifts category value. These self-imposed challenges show players actively reshaping category significance through voluntary constraint. The role of categories in fostering discovery moments creates gameplay highlights where encountering new category members generates excitement and surprise. Finding your first Shinomoni Pokémon, discovering a legendary lurking in an optional cave, or learning that a Pokémon you raised has a split evolution all create memorable moments tied to category revelation. These discovery experiences are carefully designed, with rare categories placed to reward exploration and attention. Sound design associated with different categories creates audio signatures that enhance category identity and recognition. Legendary Pokémon often have unique battle music, emphasizing their significance, while shiny Pokémon produce distinctive sparkle sounds upon encounter. These audio cues become associated with categories themselves, creating multi-sensory category recognition that extends beyond visual or mechanical identification. The animation quality and effort invested in different categories reflects their relative importance and expected player engagement. Legendary Pokémon typically receive elaborate battle animations with multiple camera angles and dramatic effects, while common Pokémon might have simpler animation sets. This production value hierarchy reinforces category significance through presentation polish, making important categories feel appropriately special. Walking, running, and following Pokémon mechanics interact with categories in games where these features exist, with large Pokémon having different following behaviors than small ones, and flying types hovering rather than walking. These category-specific behaviors add personality and realism to the overworld experience, making categories feel like biological realities rather than just stat blocks and battle mechanics. Size categories like Wailord's enormous stature or Joltik's tiny frame create practical challenges in overworld implementation and battle animations, with developers working to display these extreme size differences meaningfully without breaking visual coherence. The commitment to representing size variation demonstrates attention to detail that enriches category diversity, making each species feel physically distinct beyond type and stats. The photography mechanics in games like Pokémon Snap create categories based on behavior and pose quality rather than battle. Statistics requiring players to understand species habits and preferences to capture excellent photos. This alternative engagement with categories shows how the same creatures can support completely different gameplay systems while maintaining consistent identities across contexts. Amy, Refresh, and Camp mechanics introduce affection and care as gameplay elements, with different Pokémon categories having unique interaction animations and preferences. Baby Pokémon might have different care requirements than fully evolved Pokémon, while certain species enjoy specific foods or toys. These care-based categories add nurturing gameplay that contrasts with battle-focused mechanics, appealing to players who who value companionship over competition. The cooking and curry mechanics in certain games create food preference categories where Pokémon react differently to various ingredients and preparations. These preferences sometimes correlate with types, with fire types enjoying spicy food, while water types prefer sweet flavors, creating logical connections between category memberships and gameplay systems. The food mechanics add life simulation elements that complement battle systems. Contest categories organize Pokémon by appeal, beauty, coolness, cuteness, cleverness, and toughness, creating alternative progression paths that value attributes beyond battle statistics. Pokémon excel in different contest categories based on their designs and move types, allowing species that are poor battlers to shine in contest scenarios. This multi-dimensional success framework prevents any category from being universally weak by providing alternative contexts for value. The Pokéathlon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver created sports-based categories where speed, power, skill, stamina, and jump stats determined performance in athletic competitions. These alternative stats gave every Pokémon potential niches regardless of battle viability, demonstrating commitment to making all categories valuable in some context. The Pokéathlon minigames showed creative thinking about how Pokémon abilities could translate into non-combat gameplay. Musicals and showcase performances introduce entertainment and performance categories where visual appeal and timing matter more than stats or types. These performance systems allow players to engage with their Pokémon as performers and partners rather than just battle tools, creating emotional connections through shared creative expression. The performance categories add variety to gameplay while serving players who prefer non-violent engagement. The philosophical question of whether categories exist objectively or are imposed arbitrarily by observers applies to Pokémon classification systems, with some categories like type being fundamental to game mechanics, while others like tier placement are entirely community created. This distinction between intrinsic and constructed categories mirrors real-world debates about natural kinds versus human taxonomies, adding unexpected depth to what might seem like simple game mechanics. The accessibility of category information through official channels versus community resources creates knowledge barriers that can exclude casual players from understanding complex systems. Egg groups, hidden abilities, and IV mechanics are poorly explained in early games, requiring external research to master. More recent games include better tutorials and explanations, lowering these knowledge barriers and making category mastery more accessible. The relationship between categories and individual Pokémon personalities creates tension between viewing creatures as category members versus unique individuals. A player's starter, Charizard, is not just another fire-flying starter, but a specific companion with shared history and emotional significance. Categories provide useful organizational frameworks, while individual relationships transcend categorical thinking, creating productive tension between general and specific. The preservation of category knowledge across player generations shows how information passes from experienced players to newcomers through teaching, content creation, and community resources. This knowledge transfer ensures that category understanding persists and evolves rather than being rediscovered from scratch by each new player cohort. The community acts as collective memory, maintaining institutional knowledge that enriches everyone's experience. The merchandise ecosystem built around categories creates physical manifestations of virtual classifications, with plush toys, figures, and cards representing different category members in tangible form. Collecting physical representations of categories extends engagement beyond digital play into material reality. creating cross-media experiences that reinforce category knowledge and affection. The physical goods become anchors for memories and relationships with digital creatures. The streaming economy around Pokémon creates content categories that parallel game categories, with streamers specializing in specific types of content like shiny hunting, nuzlocke challenges, or competitive analysis. These content categories aggregate audiences around shared interests, creating communities within communities based on preferred engagement styles. The streaming landscape demonstrates how game categories generate derivative classification systems in related media. The tournament scene organizes competitive play around category-based restrictions and regulations, with different tournament formats allowing different legendary tiers, item usage rules, and team construction requirements. These format variations create diverse competitive ecosystems where category knowledge becomes essential for format-appropriate team building. Understanding which categories are legal in each format prevents disqualification and enables strategic preparation. The global nature of Pokémon creates interesting category localization challenges where certain category names or concepts translate awkwardly across languages and cultures. Regional forms might reference region-specific cultural elements that resonate differently in various markets, while some category concepts require explanation in cultures less familiar with Japanese gaming conventions. The localization teams work to preserve category meaning while adapting presentation for diverse audiences. Historical category mistakes and retcons demonstrate that even official classifications can change as developers reconsider past decisions. Pokémon have had types added or changed, egg groups reassigned, and stats redistributed across generations, showing that categories are not immutable but subject to revision when balance or logic requires. These changes acknowledge that initial classifications may have been imperfect and demonstrate willingness to improve systems despite disrupting established knowledge. The data mining community discovers unused category content in game files, revealing features in a Pokémon that were designed but cut before release. These discovered categories of unused content create alternative histories where different design decisions might have led to different category structures. The glimpses into development processes add layers of appreciation for final products by showing paths not taken. The role of categories in creating artificial scarcity drives certain economic and engagement outcomes, with limited availability creating value through exclusivity. Event-exclusive mythical Pokémon cannot be obtained through normal play, creating categories of haves and have-nots that persist until distributions or generational changes make previously exclusive content more accessible. This scarcity model balances creating special experiences against fairness and completion accessibility. The integration of categories with achievement systems creates meta progression, where completing category-based challenges unlocks rewards, titles, or cosmetic options. Catching every legendary Pokémon might earn a special trainer title, while hatching a certain number of eggs could unlock avatar customization options. These achievement systems provide extrinsic motivation for category completion while acknowledging player dedication. The relationship between categories and difficulty settings in games that offer them shows how category encounters can be tuned to match players' skill levels and preferences. Higher difficulties might feature evolved Pokémon earlier or give trainers access to legendary categories sooner, while easier settings might provide better catch rates for rare categories. This difficulty scaling demonstrates category flexibility as a balancing tool. The preservation project's archiving old events, distributions, and category availability create historical records of what categories were accessible when and through what methods. These preservation efforts combat temporal exclusivity by documenting and sometimes recreating access to categories that would otherwise be permanently lost to players who missed limited windows. The community-driven nature of preservation shows dedication to making all categories ultimately accessible. The role of categories in creating gameplay loops with varying timescales shows sophisticated understanding of player retention across different engagement horizons. Daily loops might involve checking for swarm Pokémon or weather-dependent spawns. Weekly loops could include limited-time raid events, and seasonal loops bring back specific categories for limited periods. These nested temporal structures maintain engagement across multiple timescales simultaneously. The psychological principle of completion compelling players to fill Pokédexes and collect all category members demonstrates effective use of completion anxiety as engagement mechanism. The visible progress bars and checking systems create satisfying feedback when categories are completed while highlighting remaining gaps that motivated continued play. This combination of positive reinforcement for completion and negative space for incomplete sections drives collection behavior. The social comparison enabled by category completion allows players to showcase achievements and compare progress with friends or online communities. Displaying Shiny Living Pokédexes or complete regional form collections creates social capital and recognition within communities that value these accomplishments. The shared value systems make category completion socially rewarding beyond personal satisfaction. The narrative integration of categories into character identities creates memorable NPCs defined by their categorical specializations. Gym leaders specialize in specific types, rivals favor certain categories, and villainous teams pursue legendary Pokémon for their plots. These category associations make characters more distinct and memorable, while demonstrating how categories can serve characterization in addition to mechanical functions. The environmental storytelling through category distribution patterns creates implicit narratives about ecosystem relationships and habitat requirements. Finding rock and ground types in mountainous areas, while water and flying types cluster near lakes, tells environmental stories without explicit exposition. These distribution patterns make worlds feel lived in and logically consistent, rewarding players who notice and appreciate these details. The seasonal migration patterns in some games show categories moving between locations based on time of year, creating dynamic worlds that change beyond simple day-night cycles. This temporal dynamism makes worlds feel alive and responsive to time's passage, encouraging regular check-ins to see what categories are currently available. The migration patterns add realism while creating engagement loops around seasonal changes. The relationship between categories and player age demographics shows different categories appealing to different age groups, with cute baby Pokémon attracting younger players while complex competitive categories engage older audiences. The multi-generational appeal requires category diversity that serves various tastes and sophistication levels simultaneously. This breadth ensures the franchise remains relevant across life stages as players age while maintaining appeal to new young audiences. The therapeutic applications of Pokémon and its category systems have been documented in medical and psychological contexts, with the collection and organization mechanics providing structure and achievable goals for people managing anxiety or depression. The categories create manageable objectives with clear completion criteria, offering structured activities during difficult periods. The emotional support Pokémon provide through companionship extends beyond gameplay into meaningful psychological impact. The mathematical modeling possible with category statistics enables probability calculations around breeding outcomes, encounter rates, and competitive matchups. Players can calculate exact odds of hatching perfect IV Pokémon or encountering shiny variants, transforming random chance into understood probability that careful preparation can influence. This mathematical dimension adds analytical depth that appeals to players who enjoy optimization and calculation. The artistic fan communities create category-based creative works, including illustrations organizing Pokémon by type, evolution family trees, and regional form comparisons. These fan arts demonstrate deep engagement with categories as organizational concepts, using them as frameworks for creative expression. The art serves both aesthetic and educational purposes, making category relationships visible and beautiful. The crossover potential of Pokémon categories allows collaboration with other franchises through category-compatible guest Pokémon or special events. These crossovers demonstrate category flexibility as a framework that can incorporate external content while maintaining system coherence. The ability to add new category members or create special categories for crossover content shows robust, extensible design. The documentation burden of maintaining accurate category information across hundreds of Pokémon and multiple generations creates significant work for wikis, databases, and community resources. Every new game introduces category changes, new members, and mechanical adjustments that must be documented and disseminated to maintain community knowledge currency. This documentation work is largely volunteer-driven, demonstrating remarkable community dedication to preserving and sharing category understanding. The translation challenges when category names and concepts move between Japanese and English sometimes create confusion or loss of thematic coherence. Certain egg group names reference Japanese cultural concepts that lack direct English equivalents, requiring localization teams to find approximate translations that preserve functional meaning while potentially losing cultural resonance. These translation layers add complexity to category understanding for players engaging with multiple language versions. The relationship between categories and nostalgia creates powerful emotional associations where specific categories evoke memories of particular life periods, friendships, or experiences. The starter chosen during a first playthrough becomes permanently associated with that formative gaming experience, carrying emotional weight beyond its mechanical properties. These nostalgic attachments demonstrate how categories become vessels for personal history and memory. The seasonal events in mobile games like Pokémon Go create temporary category prominences where specific types or families receive enhanced spawns, special moves, or unique forms for limited periods. These rotating focal points keep the game fresh by cycling through categories systematically, ensuring all categories receive periodic attention and relevance. The rotation strategy maintains engagement by providing regular novelty within established frameworks. The raid mechanics in various Pokémon games create temporary communal goals around encountering and capturing specific category members, encouraging cooperative play around rare or powerful Pokémon. These social encounters transform category hunting from solitary activity into shared experience, building community through collaborative pursuit of common goals. The raid structures demonstrate how categories can enable social gameplay in traditionally single-player contexts. The home transfer services and Pokémon bank systems create meta-categories of transferable versus non-transferable Pokémon, with certain categories or forms being restricted from moving between games. These Transfer restrictions sometimes prevent moving Pokémon forward through generations, creating stranded populations that exist only in specific games. The transfer mechanics acknowledge technical and balance considerations while creating practical limitations on category continuity. The living Pokédex concept represents the ultimate category completion challenge, requiring not just catching every Pokémon, but maintaining permanent collections, including every evolution stage and form. This massive undertaking appeals to completionists willing to invest hundreds of hours managing box space and organizing collections across multiple categories simultaneously. The living Pokédex demonstrates extreme dedication while showcasing comprehensive category mastery. The box organization strategies that players develop demonstrate personal category systems and organizational philosophies beyond official classifications. Some players organize by type, others by evolution family, and still others by acquisition date or sentimental value. These personal taxonomies show how individuals impose meaningful structure on their collections according to their own logic and priorities. The naming conventions that players use for Pokémon create another layer of personal categorization, with nicknames sometimes indicating category membership, role, or personal significance. Naming every member of a specific category identically creates instant recognition, while unique names personalize individual Pokémon and distinguish them from category abstraction. The naming practices reveal how players balance categorical thinking with individual recognition. The frustration that arises from category-based exclusions and restrictions demonstrates how categories can limit, as well as enable, with certain Pokémon being unusable in specific formats or contexts due to their category membership. These restrictions, while necessary for balance, can disappoint players attached to specific Pokémon that happen to fall into restricted categories. The tension between access and balance remains ongoing across competitive formats. The celebration of category diversity in official communications and marketing shows developer awareness that different players value different categories, with promotional materials showcasing variety rather than privileging specific types or power levels. This inclusive marketing approach validates diverse playstyles and preferences, acknowledging that competitive viability is not the only meaningful measure of category worth. The educational outreach programs using Pokémon to teach various subjects demonstrate category versatility as pedagogical tools, with biological classifications teaching taxonomy, stat calculations teaching mathematics, and strategic planning teaching critical thinking. The game mechanics become educational scaffolding that makes abstract concepts concrete and engaging. The success of these programs shows how entertainment categories can serve serious educational purposes. The accessibility features in newer games consider how categories might present barriers to different player populations, with the options to skip evolution animations, simplify catching mechanics, or adjust difficulty affecting how players engage with various categories. These accessibility options democratize category engagement, allowing more players to experience category completion regardless of physical or cognitive differences. The environmental themes embedded in certain categories create ecological messaging about conservation, adaptation, and biodiversity that resonates beyond gameplay into real-world awareness. Regional forms demonstrate adaptation to environmental pressures, while extinct fossil Pokémon remind players about extinction and loss. These thematic elements use categories to communicate values and perspectives about nature and human relationships with environment. The gender representation across categories shows evolution in character and creature design, with the early generations featuring fewer female prominent categories, while later games introduce more diverse representations. This progression reflects broader cultural shifts toward inclusivity and representation, demonstrating how game content evolves alongside social values. The disability representation in certain Pokémon categories, like Pokémon with visual or mobility differences that nonetheless function effectively, creates positive messaging about capability and value despite difference. These representations normalize diversity while showing that limitations in one area do not diminish overall worth or capability. The memorial aspects of certain categories create spaces for processing loss and grief through gameplay metaphors, with ghost types often representing deceased beings or lost spirits. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town confronts death directly, creating rare moments in children's media where mortality is acknowledged and mourned rather than avoided. The celebration and festival mechanics tied to specific categories create positive cultural associations, with events honoring particular types or families through in-game holidays and special distributions. These celebrations validate player affections for specific categories while creating memorable moments tied to community participation and limited time access. The role of categories in creating strategic depth without overwhelming complexity shows sophisticated design balancing, where systems are comprehensible enough for casual understanding, but deep enough for expert mastery. The layered nature allows players to engage at their preferred depth level, from simple type matching to complex IV breeding and ability optimization. The future uncertainty of category evolution creates anticipation and speculation within communities, with players theorizing about potential new categories, mechanics, or classification changes in upcoming games. This forward-looking engagement maintains interest during gaps between releases while demonstrating investment in franchise future and ongoing category development. The preservation of category knowledge for future generations ensures that understanding accumulated over decades remains accessible rather than being lost to time and technological obsolescence. Archives of strategy guides, competitive analyses, and community resources serve as cultural artifacts documenting how categories were understood and valued during specific historical periods. The intergenerational play enabled by category stability allows parents who played original games to share experiences with children playing current releases, with starter Pokémon, legendary encounters, and evolution mechanics remaining recognizable across decades. This continuity creates family bonding opportunities around shared category knowledge, with parents teaching children about categories they mastered years ago while learning about new additions together. The streaming culture around category-specific challenges creates entertainment content that showcases category depth while building audiences around particular engagement styles. Shiny-only playthroughs, legendary-only teams, and baby Pokémon challenges all demonstrate creative category restrictions that generate engaging content while displaying mastery of category mechanics and limitations. The speedrunning optimization around categories demonstrates how different playstyles create radically different category valuations, with the early game Pokémon becoming valuable for their immediate availability despite weak stats. The runner's calculus privileges speed over power, creating category hierarchies inverted from competitive battle perspectives and showing how context fundamentally reshapes value. The role-playing communities that organize Pokémon journeys around the character concepts and narratives use categories to express personality and its backstory through team composition. A character concept of a bug catcher dedicated to insect Pokémon creates category restrictions that serve storytelling purposes, with mechanical limitations becoming narrative features that deepen immersion and characterization. The challenge-run communities continuously invent new, category-based restrictions that test players' skill and knowledge, from monotype runs limiting teams to single types to nuzlocke variants, adding permadeath and limited catching. These self-imposed category limitations demonstrate how creative restriction generates engagement and difficulty from systems designed to be broadly accessible. The mathematical optimization communities calculate ideal category combinations for specific goals, determining which egg group chains enable particular move inheritance or which breeding pairs produce optimal IV distributions fastest. This analytical approach to categories transforms them into variables in optimization problems, creating puzzle-like engagement for players who enjoy calculation and efficiency. The artistic communities create category-organized fan content, including evolutionary family portraits, type-themed illustrations, and regional form comparisons that visualize category relationships creatively. These fan works serve educational purposes while celebrating category diversity through artistic expression, making abstract relationships concrete and beautiful. The wiki maintenance communities preserve detailed category information across games and generations, documenting changes, tracking additions, and maintaining comprehensive databases that serve as essential references for serious players. This volunteer labor ensures category knowledge remains accessible and current despite constant expansion and revision. The tournament organization communities develop category-based rule sets that create diverse competitive environments, with different formats allowing different legendary tiers, item usage patterns, and team construction requirements. These format variations keep competitive play fresh while requiring deep category knowledge to build format-appropriate teams and strategies. The collecting communities focused on complete category representation pursue living Pokédexes, shiny collections, and form completion with dedication that transforms casual play into serious long-term projects. These completion goals provide structure and motivation that sustains engagement across years, with categories creating the organizational frameworks that make massive collections manageable. The preservation communities work to document limited-time category distributions and event-exclusive content that would otherwise be lost to players who missed narrow availability windows. This archival work ensures future players can learn about historical category availability even when they cannot access the Pokémon themselves. As these final thoughts settle into stillness and the gentle pull of sleep grows stronger, we recognize that our exploration of Pokémon categories has revealed systems simultaneously mechanical and meaningful, functional and beautiful, simple and infinitely complex. The categories organize a vast fictional universe into comprehensible frameworks while preserving mystery and discovery around every corner. They enable mastery while rewarding exploration, provide structure while encouraging creativity, and create communities while honoring individual relationships. The hours we have spent together tonight, wandering through these taxonomies, have shown how classification systems can be more than organizational convenience, becoming instead foundations for engagement, learning, community, and personal expression. Each category we discussed represents countless hours of player joy, frustration, achievement, and memory across millions of individual experiences spanning decades and continents. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.